Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. The ATM was bathed in pale blue light, a lonely beacon on an otherwise quiet street. I had parked my car just a few feet away, keeping the engine running for warmth. It was late, close to midnight, and the crisp night air felt sharper than usual. The kind of cold that cuts through your jacket and settles in your bones. I wasn't planning to stay long. Just a quick withdrawal, enough cash to cover a few things I needed the next day. I glanced over my shoulder as I stepped up to the machine. The street was empty, except for a few parked cars scattered down the block. Nothing moved. No pedestrians, no traffic. A faint hum from the streetlights was the only sound. It was quiet, too quiet, but that's what I liked about this time of night. Fewer people, less hassle. The ATM whirred as I punched in my PIN and selected the withdrawal amount. I reached into my pocket, half distracted, fiddling with my phone to check my messages. The machine spat out the cash, and I grabbed the bills, stuffing them into my wallet. That's when I heard it. A faint rustle, like shoes scraping against pavement. At first, I thought it was just the wind kicking up some debris, but then it came again, closer this time. A deliberate step. I froze, my hand still on my wallet, and turned slowly. A man emerged from the shadows near the corner of the building. He wasn't tall, but he was solidly built, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. His face was partially obscured, but the glint of his eyes caught the light from the ATM. He wasn't running, wasn't rushing toward me, he was walking, slow and deliberate, like he already knew I wasn't going anywhere. "Hey," he said, his voice low and steady. "Don't make this hard." I felt my stomach drop. My grip on my wallet tightened instinctively, even as my brain screamed at me to stay calm. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice sounding thinner than I intended. He stepped closer, and I could see the outline of something in his hand, a knife. Not huge, but sharp enough to get his point across. "The money," he said, nodding toward my wallet. "All of it. Now." My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I raised my hand slightly, trying to show I wasn't going to fight him. "All right, man, just take it easy," I said, fumbling with my wallet. I pulled out the cash I had just withdrawn and held it out to him. He snatched it quickly, but instead of walking away, he stayed put, his eyes narrowing. "That's it? That's all you got?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, that's all I took out." He didn't look convinced. His grip on the knife shifted slightly, and he took another step forward. "Nah, I think you've got more. And you're gonna get it for me." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "What?" "The ATM," he said, nodding toward it. "You're gonna take out more. And if this one doesn't let you, we'll go to another." I felt my knees go weak. This wasn't just a quick robbery anymore. He wanted to prolong this, to make me go along with whatever twisted plan he had in mind. "Look, I don't have a lot in my account," I said, trying to reason with him. "I can't." He cut me off with a sharp gesture, the blade catching the light. "Stop talking into what I say. You don't want this to get worse." I hesitated, my mind racing through my options. The ATM was right there, but my gut told me this wouldn't end with just another withdrawal. He was too calm, too methodical, and that terrified me more than anything. This wasn't his first time. "Fine," I said finally, stepping back toward the machine. My hands were shaking as I inserted my card and punched in my PIN again. The screen asked how much I wanted to withdraw, and I selected the maximum. It wasn't much, just a couple hundred, but it was all I could take out. The cash came out in a neat stack, and I handed it to him, hoping it would be enough to make him leave. But he just took it, stuffing it into his pocket without a word. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "Let's go," he said. My heart skipped a beat. "Go where?" He motioned toward my car with the knife. "To another ATM. I know there's more around here. We're gonna hit a few, see how much you can pull out." I felt trapped, cornered. If I got into that car with him, I had no idea what would happen next, but none of the possibilities were good. My thoughts were racing, trying to come up with a way out. "Look, man, you've got the cash," I said, trying to sound calm. "Just take it and go." "I won't say anything, I swear." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Get in the car." I didn't move. My body felt like it was frozen, caught between the urge to run and the fear of what would happen if I did. He took another step closer, and I could feel the sharp edge of the blade in his voice as he spoke again. "Don't make me repeat myself." My mind was screaming at me to think, to act, to do something before it was too late. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw headlights approaching from down the street. A car, moving slowly, its engine humming softly in the distance. It was like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the car coming closer, and then I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. "Help! Call the police!" My voice echoed off the empty buildings, loud and desperate. The man's expression twisted into anger, and he lunged toward me, but the sudden commotion must have startled him. The approaching car slowed down, its headlights washing over us, and I saw the man hesitate. For a split second, he seemed unsure of what to do. That was all I needed. I turned and ran, sprinting toward the car with everything I had. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked shocked as I waved my arms frantically, shouting for help. She rolled down her window just as I reached her, and I blurted out, "He's got a knife. Call the police." Behind me, I heard the man curse loudly, but when I turned to look, he was already running the other way, disappearing into the shadows. The woman grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she tried to explain what had happened. I stayed by her car, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It felt like hours before the police arrived, though it was probably only a few minutes. I told them everything about the ATM, the knife, the cash, and the man's demand to take me to another machine. They took my statement, searched the area, but he was gone. I still think about that night. About how close I came to getting into that car, and what might have happened if I had. The police never found him, and I doubt they ever will. But every time I pass an ATM now, I feel that same knot in my stomach, the memory of those eyes watching me from the shadows. It started on a Wednesday morning, one of those quiet days where nothing seems out of place. I was home alone, working in my makeshift office near the front of the house. The neighborhood was still, with most people off at work or school. The only sounds were the occasional car passing by and the faint hum of the heater kicking in. Around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Not a casual tap-tap, but 3 firm knocks. It startled me enough that I jumped, spilling some coffee onto my desk. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the doorbell hadn't rung. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. When I opened the door, a man stood on the porch. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, and dressed in a plain button-up shirt and slacks. He carried a clipboard and wore a badge clipped to his pocket. The badge looked official enough, though I couldn't make out what it said from where I stood. "Good morning," he said with a polite smile. "Sorry to bother you. I'm with the city's survey department. We're conducting property evaluations in the area, and I just need to confirm a few details about your home." His tone was professional, his demeanor calm. There was nothing inherently alarming about him, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was how he kept glancing past me, like he was trying to look inside the house. "Ah, sure," I said, hesitantly. "What do you need to know?" He looked down at his clipboard and flipped through a few papers. "I just need to verify some basic information. Number of bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, things like that. It's for the city records." I hesitated. Wouldn't that information already be on file? His smile didn't falter, but there was a slight pause before he answered. "Sometimes the records aren't updated accurately. It's just a quick confirmation." I didn't love the idea of giving out details about my house to a stranger, even one claiming to be from the city. "Do you have any identification?" I asked, keeping my hand on the door. "Of course," he said, reaching for the badge on his pocket. He held it up, but not close enough for me to see it clearly. "See? Official surveyor. I can give you a contact number if you'd like to confirm." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. His badge looked generic, the kind you could order online. The name on it didn't match the department logo. My gut told me this wasn't right, and I decided to trust it. "I'm sorry," I said firmly, "but I'm not comfortable sharing information about my home. If you need anything, you can contact me through the proper channels." His smile faded, and his expression shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't anger, but something colder. "All right," he said after a moment, his tone still polite but clipped. "No problem. Have a good day." He turned and walked away, heading down the driveway toward the street. I watched him go, noting how he didn't stop at any of my neighbors' houses. He just got into a gray sedan parked a few houses down and drove off. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The encounter didn't sit right, but I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was legit, and I'd just been overly cautious. Better safe than sorry, I told myself. That night, I locked the doors and windows as usual. I double-checked everything, even though I didn't always do that. It wasn't paranoia, I told myself, just being careful. The next morning, I found the back gate open. It wasn't broken or hanging off its hinges, just unlatched. I knew I had closed it the day before because I'd let the dog out after lunch. I always made a point to latch it afterward. I walked around the yard, looking for anything out of place. That's when I noticed faint footprints in the dirt near the side of the house. They were too big to be mine and too fresh to be old. I knelt down to get a better look, and my heart sank. They led straight to one of the windows. The window screen had been tampered with. It wasn't torn, but it had been partially pried away from the frame. Whoever did it didn't get inside. The window was still locked, but the attempt was clear. Someone had been here. My mind immediately went to the city surveyor from the day before. His questions, his clipboard, the way he looked past me into the house, it all clicked. He wasn't from the city. He had been scouting my home, testing whether I'd be an easy target. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who came to the house listened carefully as I described the man and what had happened. He nodded as I spoke, his expression grim. "This isn't the first time we've heard about something like this," he said. There's been a few reports of people posing as utility workers or city officials to gain access to homes. He took down all the details I could remember, the man's appearance, his car, the fake badge, and assured me they'd investigate. But there wasn't much they could do without more information. Just be vigilant, he said before leaving. If you see him again, call us immediately. For the next few days, I felt like I was living in a bubble of paranoia. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept all the blinds closed and checked the locks multiple times a day. I even installed a camera above the front door, something I'd been meaning to do for months but had always put off. Then, a week later, I spotted the gray sedan parked down the street again. It was the same car, I was sure of it. It sat there for hours, the windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. I haven't seen the man since, but the experience has stayed with me. It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything, that makes you second-guess every knock at the door. I still don't know what he was planning, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts that day. It might have saved me from something far worse. The parking garage was almost silent, except for the soft echo of my sneakers against the concrete. It was late, probably around 9:30 p.m., and I'd stayed on campus longer than planned, finishing a group project in one of the library study rooms. Most of the other students had left hours ago, and I was eager to get back to my apartment and unwind. I wasn't nervous, not at first. I'd parked on the third level of the garage, which wasn't unusual since the lower levels fill up quickly during the day. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a dull yellow glow over the rows of cars. My little blue sedan was parked near the far corner, and as I approached the staircase to head up, I pulled out my keys, dangling them between my fingers like I always did. It was a small habit that made me feel safer, even though I'd never had a reason to feel unsafe here before. About halfway up the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me. Not loud, just the faint scuff of shoes on the concrete steps. I didn't think much of it, after all, other students used this garage too. But when I glanced back, I saw a man a few steps below me. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, his hands tucked into the front pocket. I didn't recognize him, but that wasn't unusual either. This was a big campus, and lots of people parked here. Still, something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he kept his head down, his face partially obscured by the hood. Or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't heard anyone else in the garage until now. I picked up my pace a little, trying not to overreact. He was probably just another student heading to his car, and I didn't want to make myself paranoid over nothing. But as I reached the third level and stepped out into the open, I realized his footsteps were still behind me. He hadn't slowed down, and when I glanced back again, he was still there, maintaining the same distance between us. That's when I started to feel the first flickers of fear. My car was maybe 50 feet away, parked near the far wall. The rows of cars around it were sparse, the level mostly empty this late. I told myself to stay calm, to focus on getting to my car and locking the doors. The man was probably harmless, just a coincidence, I thought. But as I walked toward my car, I noticed something strange. Every time I sped up, so did he. I slowed down slightly, pretending to adjust the strap of my bag, and his pace slowed too. He wasn't walking directly toward me, but he was following close enough to match my movements. My heart started to pound, the sound of it roaring in my ears. When I reached my car, I hesitated. I didn't want to turn my back on him to unlock the door, but standing there felt just as dangerous. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that he'd stopped about 20 feet away, his hood still up. He wasn't looking at me directly, but he was close enough that there was no mistaking his presence. I fumbled with my keys, trying to keep my hands steady as I pressed the unlock button. The car beeped softly, and I yanked the driver's door open. Just as I slid into the seat and locked the doors, I saw him start walking again, this time directly toward me. My breathing was ragged as I jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine. He was maybe 10 feet away now, and as the headlights illuminated him, I caught a better look at his face. He was older than I'd initially thought, maybe mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and a blank expression that sent chills down my spine. I threw the car into reverse, my tires squealing as I backed out of the space. He stopped walking and just stood there, watching as I turned the car around and sped toward the exit ramp. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep a grip on the wheel. When I reached the exit gate, I fumbled for my parking pass and swiped it as quickly as I could. The gate arm lifted, and I floored it out of the garage, not daring to look in my rearview mirror until I was several blocks away. It wasn't until I pulled into the lot of a well-lit gas station that I let myself breathe again. My chest felt tight, and my mind raced with 100 different scenarios of what could have happened if I hadn't gotten to my car in time. I sat there for a while, staring at the glowing lights of the convenience store, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't call the police. I didn't have a good description of the man, and technically, he hadn't done anything illegal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been waiting for me, that he'd chosen me for some reason I couldn't understand. For the next few weeks, I avoided parking in that garage. I started using the bus to get to campus, even though it added extra time to my commute. I told a few friends about what happened, and they tried to reassure me that it was probably nothing. Just some weirdo, they said. He probably wasn't even following you. But I knew better. The way he'd matched my pace, the way he stopped when I stopped, and the way he walked toward me at the end, it wasn't random. He'd been following me, and I was lucky to get away when I did. To this day, I can't walk through a parking garage without feeling that same tightness in my chest, that same instinct to look over my shoulder. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I trust my instincts now, and I'll never ignore that feeling again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A solo getaway to decompress, clear my head, and get some writing done. I booked a modest hotel in a quiet city where I wouldn't know anyone, deliberately choosing some place that didn't feel too touristy. The hotel itself wasn't fancy, but it had good reviews online and seemed clean and safe, exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I had dinner at a small cafe nearby, came back to the room, and spent a couple of hours watching TV before heading to bed. The room was on the 4th floor, tucked at the end of a long hallway. It was quiet, with the faint hum of the HVAC system filling the silence. I liked the solitude. The second night, however, was when things got strange. It was around 10 p.m. I'd spent most of the day walking around the city and was feeling tired but satisfied. After a long shower, I changed into pajamas and settled into bed with my laptop, trying to work on a short story I'd been meaning to finish. I'd barely typed a paragraph when I heard a soft knock at the door. It startled me. I hadn't ordered room service or requested anything from the front desk. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. "Housekeeping," a woman's voice called out. I frowned. It didn't make sense for housekeeping to come by this late. Normally, they clean the rooms during the day, and if you need something after hours, you call the front desk. My mind immediately went to all the stories I'd read online about scams and hotel thefts. But I told myself I was probably overreacting, Maybe they were short-staffed or had a new hire who didn't know the schedule. Still, something didn't feel right. I got out of bed and approached the door cautiously. The peephole was foggy, maybe scratched from years of use, so I couldn't see much beyond a vague silhouette. The voice called out again, "Housekeeping." "Just checking in." That didn't make sense. Why would housekeeping need to check in at 10 p.m.? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. "What do you need?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause. "Towels," she said finally. "I have fresh towels." "I didn't ask for any," I replied. Another pause. "Then, it's complimentary." I stepped back from the door, my heart starting to race. Something about her tone felt off. It was too rehearsed, like she wasn't used to saying it but thought it sounded convincing. My instinct screamed at me not to open the door. "No, thank you," I said firmly. "I'm fine." For a moment, there was silence. Then, I heard the faintest sound, like someone brushing against the door or leaning against it. My skin prickled. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated down the hallway. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I double-checked the lock and slid the metal latch across for good measure. Then I sat back on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. Maybe it was nothing, just a confused employee or a harmless mistake. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The rest of the night, I couldn't relax. Every little sound from the hallway made me tense up, imagining the worst. I eventually fell asleep with the lights and the TV on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The next morning, I went down to the front desk. The woman behind the counter greeted me with a cheerful smile. I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I finally asked, "Does housekeeping normally do rounds late at night?" "Around 10 p.m.? Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. "No, not at all," she said. "Housekeeping finishes their shifts by 6 p.m. Was someone bothering you?" I told her what happened, trying to keep my voice calm. Her expression grew more concerned as I spoke. She assured me that no staff had been scheduled for my floor at that time and promised to look into it. I nodded, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't go away. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the incident. I avoided the hotel as much as possible, spending hours in coffee shops and public parks, surrounded by other people. When I finally returned that evening, I asked for a different room, preferably on a higher floor. The staff accommodated my request without question, and I felt a small sense of relief. But that night, as I lay in bed in my new room, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice at the door. The pauses in her answers. The way she'd lingered, as if waiting for me to open up. I wondered what would have happened if I had. Would she have come in alone? Or was someone else waiting around the corner, out of sight? I don't know who or what was behind that door. Maybe it really was just a harmless misunderstanding. Or maybe it wasn't. All I know is that I've learned to trust my instincts, even when the logical part of my brain tells me I'm being silly. Sometimes, that gut feeling is all you have to keep you safe. The first note was nothing more than a curiosity. I'd moved into this house 3 months ago, drawn to its affordable price and the promise of a quiet neighborhood. The backyard was small but private, bordered by a high wooden fence that separated it from the neighbor's property. I hadn't seen much of the person who lived there, just glimpses of an older man through the slats of the fence when I was out mowing the lawn. He never waved, and I figured he preferred to keep to himself. Fine by me. The note was on plain white paper, folded once and wedged under the bottom edge of the fence. I almost missed it as I was watering the garden one afternoon. Curious, I picked it up and unfolded it. Keep your dog on your side. I didn't have a dog. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Maybe the man next door thought my dog, a dog I didn't have, was getting into his yard. But my yard was fully fenced in, and I hadn't seen so much as a stray animal since I moved in. I set the note aside, figuring it wasn't worth the effort to respond. 2 days later, I found another note in the same spot. Don't think I don't notice what you're doing. That one made me pause. There was no context, no signature. Just those words scrawled in uneven handwriting, as if the person writing it had been shaking. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it must be some sort of misunderstanding. Maybe he thought I was someone else. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. A week passed without incident, and I started to forget about the notes. Then one evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed something sticking out from under the fence again. Another note. You're not fooling anyone. Stay out of my yard. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I'd never set foot in his yard. I hadn't even tried to peek over the fence. My first instinct was to go knock on his door and clear up whatever confusion he had, but something about the tone of the notes made me hesitate. If he was this paranoid, would showing up at his door make things worse? Instead, I wrote my own note. I kept it short and polite, explaining that I didn't have a dog and had no reason to be in his yard. I slipped it under the fence and went back inside, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next day, there was another note. Nice try. I know what you're really doing. The words sent a chill down my spine. What did he think I was doing? Why wouldn't he just come talk to me if there was a problem? Over the next week, the notes kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. I see you watching me. Stay away from my house. Don't think I won't defend myself. By this point, I was locking my doors and double-checking the windows at night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even inside my own home. One night, I stayed up late, hoping to catch whoever was slipping the notes under the fence. I sat by the window that faced the backyard, the lights off, waiting. Around midnight, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on the other side of the fence. I held my breath, peering into the darkness. A shadow moved along the fence line. I couldn't see much, just the outline of someone hunched over near the ground. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The next morning, I found the worst note yet. I know you're alone. You won't be for long. I went straight to the police. I brought the notes with me, explained the situation, and even mentioned the shadow I'd seen. The officer I spoke to was polite but not particularly helpful. He said they couldn't do much unless there was a direct threat or evidence of a crime. He suggested installing a security camera and keeping an eye out. So that's what I did. I bought a motion-activated camera and set it up in the backyard, aimed at the fence. The first night it recorded nothing but a raccoon rummaging through the bushes. The second night, the camera caught something, or rather, someone. It was the man next door. The footage showed him creeping along the fence line, slipping a folded piece of paper underneath before disappearing back into the darkness. His movements were slow and deliberate, and even on the grainy footage, I could see how hunched and tense he was. I brought the footage back to the police. This time, they took it more seriously. They sent an officer to talk to my neighbor, but when they knocked on his door, no one answered. The officer told me they'd keep an eye on the situation and advised me to stay vigilant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining him watching me, lurking just out of sight. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise outside, a faint rustling, like someone brushing against the bushes. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed. The screen showed the backyard, dimly lit by the porch light. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, movement. He was standing by the fence, staring directly at the camera. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Just stood there, staring. Then he raised his hand, and I saw he was holding a piece of paper. He crouched down, slid it under the fence, and walked away. I didn't go outside to get the note until morning. When I finally unfolded it, my hands were shaking. Soon. That was all it said. Just one word, scrawled in the same uneven handwriting. I didn't stick around to find out what he meant. I packed a bag, called a friend, and left that day. The police promised to keep investigating, but as far as I know, nothing ever came of it. I don't know what his problem was, or what he thought I'd done. Maybe he was just lonely, or maybe he was truly dangerous. Either way, I wasn't going to wait to find out. The car sputtered twice before dying completely. I was at the corner of 4th and Main, one of the busiest intersections in town, with traffic piling up around me. Drivers honked, and a few rolled down their windows to yell as they passed. I waved apologetically, my face burning with embarrassment. My car, a 15-year-old sedan I'd been meaning to replace, had been acting up for weeks. Now it had finally given up. I grabbed my phone and called my roadside assistance service. The operator told me it would be at least 45 minutes before a tow truck could get to me. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't surprising either. Stay in your car with the doors locked, the operator advised before hanging up. If anyone offers to help, let them know a tow was on the way. I nodded to myself, even though she couldn't see me. I locked the doors and settled into my seat, trying to look as unapproachable as possible. People kept honking as they passed, but no one stopped. That was fine by me. I didn't want anyone stopping. I just wanted the tow truck to hurry up and rescue me. About 10 minutes in, I saw a man approaching. He came from the sidewalk, weaving between the stopped cars to get to mine. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing jeans and a faded jacket. His hair was a little messy, and he had a kind of scruffy beard. I stiffened as he got closer, but I didn't roll down the window. He knocked on the driver's side door, then gestured for me to lower the window. I cracked it just enough to speak. "Hi. I'm fine, thanks. I've got a tow truck on the way." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, that's good. I just saw you sitting here and thought you might need some help. You know, these old cars can be tricky." I forced a polite smile. "Thanks, but I'm all set." He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned closer, resting his hands on the roof of my car. "What happened? Engine just cut out?" "Something like that," I said quickly. "You know," he said, ignoring my obvious discomfort, "I've worked on a lot of cars. I could take a look for you. Save you the trouble of waiting." I shook my head. "Really, it's fine. The tow truck's already on its way." He didn't move. "You sure? It might just be something simple. I could have you back on the road in no time." "I'm sure," I said, my voice firmer this time. His smile faltered. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at me through the glass. Then he nodded, but instead of walking away, he circled around to the passenger side. I locked the passenger door before he could try it, and he stopped short, staring at the lock like he hadn't expected that. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, looking at me again. The question caught me off guard. "Ah, why?" "Just making conversation," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "You seem nervous." "Didn't mean to scare you." I didn't answer. I just stared straight ahead, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. "You from around here?" he asked, undeterred. My stomach tightened. Why would he need to know that? "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I really need you to go," I said firmly. He tilted his head, his smile returning, but now it looked wrong, too wide, too forced. "Just trying to be friendly. No need to get all upset." My heart was pounding. I glanced at my phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat. I considered calling the police, but he hadn't done anything illegal, at least not yet. "How long did they say the tow truck would be?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I didn't answer. "Bet it's lonely sitting here all by yourself," he continued. "Not the safest place to break down, you know." That did it. I picked up my phone and dialed 911. He saw what I was doing and his expression changed. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by something darker. He took a step back, raising his hands like he was trying to show he meant no harm. "Hey, no need for that," he said, his voice hard now. "I was just trying to help." I didn't respond. The dispatcher answered, and I quickly explained the situation, keeping my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. As I spoke, the man backed away. He glanced around, then turned and walked off, disappearing into the crowd of cars and pedestrians. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher until the tow truck arrived. The driver was friendly and professional, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as we loaded up my car and drove to the nearest repair shop. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that man. He wasn't just some good Samaritan trying to help, he wanted something. I don't know what, and I don't want to know. But I'll never forget the way he looked at me through the glass, like he was sizing me up. Like he was deciding whether I'd be worth the effort. We were about halfway through our planned 3-day hike in Redwood Ridge National Park when we first saw him. He was sitting on a rock near the trail, hunched over and rubbing his ankle. His backpack was slung carelessly next to him, and his clothes were dirty, like he'd been out there longer than planned. There were 5 of us in our group: me, my boyfriend Jake, and 3 of our friends. We weren't new to hiking, but this was one of our more ambitious trips. The trails here were isolated, and the cell service was non-existent. The man looked up as we approached, his face drawn and pale. He was probably in his mid-30s, with dark circles under his eyes and a scruffy beard that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in weeks. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse. "You guys have any water?" Jake handed him one of our spare bottles without hesitation. The guy gulped it down like he hadn't had a drink in hours. "Thanks," he said, wiping his mouth. "I've been out here for a while. Got turned around off the trail yesterday, and my ankle's been giving me trouble." "You're alone?" I asked, glancing around. "Yeah. Stupid, right? I figured I'd be fine doing a solo trip, but," he gestured to his ankle and gave a sheepish smile. "Not my smartest move." He introduced himself as Eric, and we spent a few minutes chatting with him. He seemed harmless, just another hiker who underestimated the difficulty of the trails. He asked if he could tag along with us until we got back to the main trailhead, and after a brief group discussion, we agreed. It felt wrong to leave him out there alone, especially if he was injured. As we started walking again, Eric fell into step with us. At first, everything seemed normal. He was friendly enough, asking us where we were from and how long we'd been hiking. But after a while, his questions started to feel off. "So, none of you brought a gun or anything?" he asked casually, glancing back at Jake. Jake shook his head. "No need. It's a national park. We've got bear spray, though." Eric chuckled. "Bear spray won't help you much against a person." The comment hung in the air, and no one responded. I caught Jake's eye, and he gave me a small shrug, like he didn't think it was worth making a big deal out of. A little later, Eric started talking about survival tactics, how easy it was to get lost in the woods, how most people wouldn't survive more than a day or two without supplies. He had this way of talking that made my skin crawl, like he was enjoying the idea of people being vulnerable out here. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, I was ready to call it a night. We found a clearing to set up camp, and Eric offered to help gather firewood. Jake and one of our friends, Sarah, went with him, while the rest of us stayed behind to set up the tents. When they came back, Eric was carrying an armful of branches and grinning like he'd just won a prize. "Found a good spot a little ways off the trail," he said. "Secluded, nice and quiet. Could be worth checking out tomorrow." That was the first real red flag. The spot we were in was already plenty secluded, and we were trying to stick to marked trails as much as possible. None of us wanted to get lost out here, especially not with someone we barely knew. We didn't say anything at the time, though. It felt awkward to question him when he hadn't done anything blatantly wrong. But later, as we sat around the fire eating dinner, I noticed Jake watching Eric closely. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside the tent made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Eric was up before any of us, pacing near the fire pit. When we started packing up, he brought up the spot he'd mentioned the night before. "Seriously, you guys should see it," he said. "It's only a mile or two off the main trail. I could show you." Jake hesitated, then shook his head. "We've got a route planned already. Don't want to get sidetracked." Eric's smile faltered for a moment, but then he nodded. "Fair enough. Guess I'll just stick with you guys for now." The day felt tense from the start. Eric kept lagging behind or wandering off, only to reappear a few minutes later. He didn't seem as friendly anymore either. His questions became more personal: how much food we packed, how often we went hiking, whether we told anyone exactly where we were going. By late afternoon, I was starting to panic. Jake and I talked quietly while Eric was out of earshot, and we agreed that we needed to lose him. We waited until we reached a fork in the trail. Jake announced that we decided to take the left path, even though it wasn't part of our original plan. Eric frowned but didn't argue. An hour later, we realized he'd been leading us in circles. The trail markers disappeared, replaced by dense trees and undergrowth. When we stopped to check the map, Eric laughed. "Looks like we're a little off course," he said, his tone light but his eyes cold. Jake stepped in front of me, his posture tense. "We need to get back to the main trail. Now." Eric shrugged. "Sure. But it's getting dark. Might be better to set up camp and figure it out in the morning." "No," Jake said firmly. "We're leaving." Eric's smile disappeared completely. He stared at Jake for a long moment, then nodded. "Suit yourself." He didn't follow us after that. We hurried back the way we come, eventually finding a marked trail again. When we reported the incident to the park rangers the next day, they seemed concerned but unsurprised. Apparently, there had been other reports of a man matching Eric's description, someone who claimed to be lost but led hikers off the trails. We never found out what his endgame was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that we were lucky to get away before we found out. I didn't think much of it the first time. It was late, probably close to midnight, when I got off my shift at the diner. The parking lot was mostly empty, just my car and a few others belonging to the night crew from the nearby gas station. I was tired, my feet aching from running orders back and forth all night, and I wasn't paying attention as I unlocked my car. That's when I noticed it. A folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I assumed it was an advertisement, maybe a coupon for an oil change or some other random thing. But when I pulled it out, I realized it wasn't that at all. It was a handwritten note. The paper was thin and crinkled, like it had been folded and unfolded a few times. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect, like someone had taken their time with every letter. "Good job tonight, my name. You looked beautiful. Can't wait to see you again." I froze. My name. It was right there, clear as day. I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty. Just the dim glow of the streetlights and the hum of the gas station sign flickering in the distance. I shoved the note into my bag and got into my car, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. I told myself it was probably just a prank. Maybe one of the guys from the kitchen thought it would be funny to mess with me. But when I asked the next day, no one admitted to it. They all laughed it off, said it was probably one of our regulars trying to flirt. I wanted to believe that. The second note showed up 3 days later. It was the same kind of paper, folded neatly under my windshield wiper. This one was longer, though, and the tone felt off. "You're so kind to everyone. You're different from the others. They don't appreciate you like I do. I see you. I know how hard you work." Again, it was signed with my name, and the handwriting was the same, deliberate and careful, almost like a child's penmanship. This time, I didn't tell anyone. I threw the note away as soon as I got home, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Whoever was leaving these notes knew my name. They knew when I worked. The third note came a week later, and this one scared me. "Why didn't you smile at me today? Did I do something wrong? You don't have to be afraid of me, my name. I just want to talk to you." By then, I was on edge. I started parking in different spots every shift, as close to the entrance as possible. I made sure to leave with other coworkers whenever I could, but sometimes that wasn't an option. Sometimes I had to walk to my car alone. I started checking my windshield before I even got close to my car. Most nights, there was nothing there. But then another note would appear, and every time, it got more personal. "You look tired tonight. Are you sleeping enough? I worry about you. Your hair looks better when it's down. You shouldn't tie it up so much. I saw you talking to that guy. Do you like him? He's not right for you." That one made me feel sick. I couldn't remember who I had talked to that night, but the idea of someone watching me, analyzing every interaction, was enough to make my skin crawl. I started carrying pepper spray. I even went to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. They told me it was probably just a harmless admirer and that unless the person made a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. By the time the sixth note appeared, I was barely sleeping. I'd see shadows moving outside my apartment windows and jump at every noise. This note was different. It wasn't tucked under my windshield wiper. Instead, it was taped to my car door, right next to the handle. Why are you ignoring me? I thought we had something special. You're hurting my feelings. I don't want to have to do something drastic. That word drastic made my stomach drop. I called out of work the next day. I told my manager everything, and to her credit, she took it seriously. She said she'd make sure someone walked me to my car from now on, and she offered to switch up my shifts to make my schedule less predictable. For a few days, things were quiet. No new notes, no strange shadows, no reason to panic. Then, one night, as I was leaving the diner with Jake, one of the line cooks, I saw him. He was standing across the street, partially hidden by a tree. He wasn't looking directly at me, but I could tell he was watching. He was wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up over his head, and his hands were shoved into his pockets. "Do you see that guy?" I whispered to Jake, nodding in the man's direction. Jake squinted, then nodded. "Yeah. Creepy. Want me to go say something?" I shook my head. "No. Let's just go." We walked to my car together, and I made sure to lock the doors as soon as I was inside. As I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, watching. That was the last time I saw him. The note stopped after that night, and eventually, I stopped looking over my shoulder. But every now and then, when I'm walking to my car in the dark or working a late shift, I feel that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone's watching me. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to leave another note. Weddings are supposed to be joyful, right? A celebration of love and family. That's what I kept telling myself when my cousin Clara married Tim last spring. It was a beautiful day, clear skies, blooming flowers, everything picture perfect. At least, it started that way. The ceremony went off without a hitch, and by the time we got to the reception hall, everyone was in good spirits. The band was playing, the food was incredible, and the open bar was keeping people happy. Clara looked radiant, and even though Tim seemed nervous, he was clearly smitten with her. I just finished my first plate of appetizers when I noticed him. He was leaning against the bar, chatting with a group of my uncles. His suit was sharp but slightly out of style, like he'd borrowed it or bought it for an event years ago and never wore it again. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a big smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I assumed he was one of Tim's relatives. I mean, there were a lot of people there I didn't recognize. Clara and Tim had invited nearly 200 guests, and our family's big enough that I still don't know some of my second and third cousins. But something about him made me pause. I noticed he wasn't holding a drink, which seemed odd given how much my uncles were knocking back. He was nodding and laughing along with whatever story they were telling, but his eyes kept scanning the room, almost like he was looking for someone. I shrugged it off. It wasn't my business, and I wasn't about to start interrogating random guests. The night wore on, and I forgot about him for a while. The speeches happened, the cake was cut, and people started hitting the dance floor. It was around then that I noticed him again, this time sitting at one of the far tables, talking to Clara's grandmother. She looked uncomfortable. Now, Grandma Helen isn't exactly a pushover. She's got this sharp wit and a no-nonsense attitude, so it was strange to see her looking so uneasy. The man was leaning in close, speaking quietly, but every now and then, his voice would rise just enough for me to catch snippets. Family history, always wanted to connect, distant cousin on your husband's side. I walked over, trying to play it casual. Hey, Grandma, everything okay? I asked, shooting the man a polite but curious look. Oh, yes, dear, Helen said quickly, her voice a little too bright. This is, Andrew. He says he's related to us through, what was it again? Through your late husband, Andrew said smoothly. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was something about the way he said late husband that made me bristle. I didn't recognize the name he gave, but again, I figured it wasn't my place to question him. Helen, however, looked skeptical. Well, it's lovely to meet you, I said, forcing a smile. I'm going to steal Grandma for a dance, if you don't mind. Andrew nodded, that strange smile never leaving his face. Once we were a safe distance away, I asked, "Who's that guy?" I have no idea, Helen whispered, glancing over her shoulder. He claims to be family, but I've never heard of him before. And he was asking all sorts of odd questions about who's here tonight, what everyone does for work, things like that. My stomach dropped. I didn't like the sound of that. For the rest of the evening, I kept an eye on him. He drifted from group to group, always inserting himself into conversations, always asking questions. At one point, I saw him talking to Tim, who looked visibly uncomfortable. When I finally got a moment with Clara, I asked her about him. Do you know that guy, the one in the gray suit? I asked. Her face clouded. No. Tim said he's some cousin on his mom's side, but when I asked his mom, she didn't know who he was either. Didn't you guys have a seating chart? Yeah, but he said he RSVP'd late and didn't get assigned a seat. I didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't want to ruin her night, so I just nodded and let it go. But the whole situation was gnawing at me. By the end of the night, people were starting to leave. Clara and Tim were getting ready for their send-off, and the staff was beginning to clean up. I went to grab my jacket from the coat check and saw Clara frantically searching through her bag. Everything okay? I asked. My purse, she said, her voice shaking. It's gone. It was under the table during dinner, and now it's gone. We searched everywhere, the table, the dance floor, even the bathrooms, but it was nowhere to be found. It wasn't just her purse, either. Tim's watch, which he'd taken off while dancing, was missing. So was one of the envelopes from their gift table. I didn't have to say it. We were all thinking the same thing. Andrew was nowhere to be found. We checked with the staff, but no one remembered seeing him leave. The security cameras in the reception hall were only pointed at the entrances, and while they showed him arriving earlier in the evening, there was no footage of him leaving. It was like he'd vanished. The police were called, but there wasn't much they could do. Clara and Tim gave them a description, and we all racked our brains trying to remember any details he might have let slip. But there was nothing concrete. The worst part? A few days later, when Clara was going through the wedding photos, she found him in the background of several shots, always lurking just out of focus. In one, he was standing by the gift table, a faint smirk on his face. We never saw him again. To this day, I can't go to a wedding without scanning the crowd for faces I don't recognize. And every time, I wonder if Andrew's out there, crashing someone else's special day, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I didn't think it would be a big deal. Moving into a shared apartment to save money seemed like the most practical option. I'd been living in a cramped studio for a while, struggling to make rent on my own, and the idea of splitting costs with someone else felt like a relief. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got on my feet, figured things out. I found the listing online, and the place seemed perfect. Affordable, in a nice neighborhood, close to work. The only catch was that my new roommate, Sarah, was someone I didn't know. But that wasn't a huge red flag. I'd seen worse situations, people meeting roommates through random ads. So, I decided to take a leap. We met for coffee before the move-in date. She seemed friendly enough, quiet, a little reserved, but not in a way that made me uncomfortable. She worked from home, which was nice because it meant we didn't have to coordinate schedules around who would be using the bathroom in the morning. I liked the idea of having a steady, calm presence in the apartment. The first few weeks went by without issue. We exchanged small talk when we crossed paths in the kitchen, shared the occasional meal, and otherwise respected each other's space. She'd occasionally ask if I wanted to join her for a walk or watch a movie, but I was always too tired or busy. The workday felt long, and I wasn't exactly in the mood to socialize. But then, little things started to change. I noticed Sarah seemed very interested in my schedule. At first, it wasn't anything alarming. She casually asked if I had plans for the weekend, what time I worked the next day, or if I had any errands to run. I figured she was just being friendly, trying to make conversation. Maybe she was just one of those people who liked to know what was going on in the lives of others. But after a while, it felt less like small talk and more like tracking. One evening, I was getting ready to leave for a dinner with a friend, and Sarah asked, "Oh, are you going to the Thai place on Maple Street again?" I froze for a moment, surprised. "Yeah." "How did you know?" She smiled, not in an awkward way, but in a way that made me feel uneasy. "You mentioned it last week." I just remember things. I shrugged it off, but something about the way she said it stuck with me. The next day, I found her in the living room while I was getting ready to leave for work. She was sitting on the couch, watching a show on her laptop. "Do you need anything from the store?" she asked casually. "No, I'm good," I said, grabbing my purse. "Why?" "I was just wondering if you needed any snacks. You usually buy the same kind of granola bars every week." That was strange. I hadn't mentioned my snacks to her, but she was right. I did buy the same ones every week. Still, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just an offhand observation. But then things got worse. Over the next few weeks, Sarah started commenting on more personal things. She'd ask about the photos I had around the apartment, about the books on my shelf. She'd ask if I had plans for my days off, how long I was planning to be at work, when I'd be coming home. And then, the worst part. I came back from work one afternoon and found that my makeup bag had been moved. I was sure I'd left it in the drawer by the bathroom sink, but now it was sitting on the edge of the countertop, a little too neatly arranged. At first, I thought maybe I'd just been forgetful. Maybe I'd moved it and didn't remember. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. The bag wasn't just moved, it was as if someone had gone through it. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. I didn't want to accuse her of something without proof. Then, one night, I came home late. Sarah was already in bed, but I noticed the lights in the kitchen were on. I walked in, and she was sitting at the table, scribbling in a notebook. She looked up at me with wide eyes, almost startled. "Oh, hey. I didn't hear you come in." I nodded, trying to stay calm. "What are you doing up this late?" "Just writing." She smiled, but it wasn't a smile that put me at ease. It was too tight. I glanced at the notebook. "What are you writing about?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the pages. Just some things. Stuff for work. I didn't press it any further, but the whole interaction felt off. The next morning, I woke up to find my car keys missing from the bowl by the door. I looked everywhere, but they were gone. I even checked Sarah's room, but the door was locked, and she wasn't home. It took me a few hours to find them, tucked into the pocket of the jacket I had left hanging on the back of the chair in the kitchen. I had no idea how they got there. That's when the thoughts started to pile up, one after another. Was I just overthinking things? Or was Sarah really doing something she shouldn't be? One evening, I decided to confront her. I had enough. "Sarah," I said, sitting across from her at the table, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from her phone, a little too quickly, as if she'd been waiting for this. "Sure, what's up?" "I've noticed some things, with my stuff, my schedule. And I just need to know if you've been going through my things." Her smile faltered for a split second, but then she regained her composure. "What do you mean?" "The makeup bag. The keys. You've been asking about my plans all the time. You know where I go and when I'm back. It's a little too much." She didn't react the way I expected. Instead of getting defensive or upset, she leaned forward, her expression unnervingly calm. "I'm just trying to be friendly, you know? I like getting to know people. And you're interesting. You have such an interesting routine. I was just curious." I couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure if I was scared or disgusted, but I knew then that I couldn't stay. I didn't want to feel like I was being watched in my own home. "I think I'm going to find a new place to live," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile anymore. It was something darker. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I understand," she said softly. "You'll be missed." That night, I packed my things. I didn't care about the rent I'd already paid. I didn't care about the mess I left behind. I just needed to get out. I didn't hear from her again after I moved out. No calls, no messages, no notes. I don't know if she was just being friendly or if she was keeping tabs on me. Either way, I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. I still don't understand what was going through her head, and I don't know if she was actually dangerous or if I was just overreacting. It started off so innocently. I was at the train station, like I have been hundreds of times before, just waiting for my train to take me home after a long day of work. The platform was quiet, just me and a few other commuters scattered around, all lost in our own thoughts, probably all just waiting for the end of the day. It was a little after 7 p.m., so it was starting to get dark, but nothing unusual, not for this time of year. I was checking my phone, scrolling through emails, when I heard someone clear their throat beside me. I looked up. There was a man standing there, probably in his mid-30s, dressed casually but with a kind of worn-out air about him. His clothes were a little too old, maybe a bit too wrinkled, but he didn't look out of place at first. Not at first. "Excuse me, can you help me with something?" he asked, his voice soft and hesitant. I put my phone down and gave him my attention. It's not unusual for people to ask for directions at the train station, so I didn't think much of it. "Sure," I said, smiling. "I'm trying to find my way to the westbound platform." "I'm new here, and I'm not exactly sure where to go," he explained, glancing around nervously as though he wasn't entirely sure where he was. I looked over at the signs. Everything was clearly marked. It's a pretty straightforward station, so I figured I could help him out. Oh, it's not far. You just have to take the escalator to the next level, then go left. It's right there. You can't miss it, I said, pointing toward the stairwell. He nodded, but then he lingered a little too long, his gaze shifting between the signs and me. Right. I thought it was down this way, he said, almost to himself. He took a half step in the direction I pointed, then stopped and looked back at me. Are you sure? I could have sworn the westbound platform is further down this way. I glanced down the platform. No, I'm pretty sure. It's just down those stairs, then to your left. I smiled again, trying to be polite. I didn't want to be rude, but I really just wanted to get back to my phone and finish what I was doing. But the man didn't move. Instead, he took a small step closer to me, just enough that it was hard not to notice. I'm sorry, I've been walking around here for a while and I think I'm a little lost, he said, his voice suddenly sounding uncertain, almost like he was unsure whether he should continue the conversation. At this point, I started to feel a little uncomfortable. There were plenty of people around, but the platform was starting to feel quieter, like people were fading into the background. I glanced over at the far end of the station and noticed that the majority of the crowd was already leaving. Their trains had arrived. I forced a smile, trying to be patient. Like I said, it's just down the escalator, then left. If you don't see the sign for westbound trains, just ask one of the station agents. They'll help you out. The man nodded slowly, but instead of moving toward the escalator, he took another step closer. A little too close for comfort. He wasn't exactly invading my space, but it felt like he was. I took a small step back, hoping that would signal him to go. But instead, he said something that made my stomach drop. You know, it's a little confusing, all these different platforms. There's a quieter spot further down, past the westbound sign. It's more private there. I froze. For a second, I didn't know how to respond. The way he said private felt all wrong. My mind immediately went to places I didn't want to think about. The station wasn't large, and while I didn't think it was dangerous, there were definitely places where you could be alone, out of sight from other commuters. I don't think you need to go that far, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The westbound platform is right there. You don't have to go anywhere else. He gave me a half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't the smile of someone just trying to be friendly. It felt forced. But what if I want to avoid the crowd? He asked, his tone a little too casual. I just need to take a break. It's a long day, you know? It's quiet down there. I didn't like how this conversation was going. Something in my gut told me this wasn't a normal interaction. I felt a twinge of anxiety, but I tried to ignore it. I don't think it's worth it, I said, hoping my voice would convince him to drop it. You're already here. The train is coming soon. Just take the escalator, and you'll be fine. He stepped a little closer again, his voice lowering as he spoke. It's not far, you know. Just a few steps down the hall. No one really goes that way. My heart started racing. I had this growing sense that something wasn't right. He was trying to steer me away from the main platform. He kept talking like it was nothing, but I wasn't stupid. I could feel it, the way he was pushing for me to go somewhere I didn't want to. I really don't think you should, I started, but before I could finish, his tone shifted. You should come with me. It's better if you just come with me, he said, the words dripping with something cold, something that felt like a threat. I didn't wait to hear more. My body went into automatic mode, and I turned quickly, walking toward the nearest exit. I could feel his eyes on my back, but I didn't dare look behind me. I reached the end of the platform where the station agent was sitting in a small booth, and I quickly slipped inside, standing there until the doors of the train finally opened. I glanced over, and sure enough, the man was still there, lingering near the escalator, his eyes fixed on me. I didn't board the train until I was sure he wasn't following me. He never did get on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that encounter. When I got home later that night, I found myself double-checking every lock and every light. I couldn't stop thinking about how he tried to coax me toward that secluded spot, how he used that almost insistent tone, as if I was supposed to follow him without question. And maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never be that trusting again when someone asks for directions. It had been a long shift. The kind where you count down the minutes, just waiting for the clock to hit closing time. It wasn't that I didn't like my job, I did, but by the end of the night, I was always ready to be done. The store was quiet, the lights had been dimmed, and the last of the shoppers had trickled out long ago. I was just finishing up, wiping down the counters and checking the inventory list one last time. The store felt empty, just how I liked it after a hectic day. I was about to lock the front door when I saw someone approaching from the parking lot. It was a man, in his early 40s maybe, dressed in a jacket and jeans. He was walking quickly, and as he reached the door, I could already feel that uncomfortable pressure in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't anything specific, he didn't seem threatening at first. He was just alone, and I'd already done the closing checklist, which meant I was almost ready to leave. I paused for a moment, hesitating. The store was technically closed, but I had let people in after hours before, especially if they were quick and respectful. It wasn't the ideal situation, but I figured one more customer wouldn't hurt. I didn't expect any problems. I unlocked the door a crack, peeking out. "Hey, sorry. We're just about to close for the night," I said, giving him a polite smile. He looked at me, his expression neutral, but there was something about the way he glanced at the door like he was already calculating how much time he had. "Oh, I'm really sorry to bother you," he said quickly. "I just need a couple of things. I swear I'll be fast." Something about the way he said it made me hesitate for a moment, but then I reminded myself that I'd let others in before. Maybe I was just tired. "Well, all right. But I'll need to lock up after you're done." "Of course. I won't be long." He gave me a smile, one that seemed normal enough, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I opened the door all the way and stepped back, letting him in. He walked past me, looking around the store. He didn't seem rushed at all, just strolling in like it was any other time of day. At first, everything seemed fine. He made his way to the back aisle where the cleaning supplies were, taking his time, picking a few things off the shelves. I went back to tidying up, trying to finish my last tasks, but I couldn't help glancing up every now and then, watching him from the corner of my eye. Then it happened. I heard a sudden sound, the rattle of an item hitting the floor, and looked up. The man was standing there, staring at me. His back was straight, his eyes narrowed. I felt a chill run through me. The shift in the atmosphere was almost immediate, like something had changed, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything all right?" I asked, my voice a little less confident now. He didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at me, and I started to get that sinking feeling in my stomach. "You know, you really shouldn't be working this late," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost too calm. I blinked, confused. Excuse me? He took a step closer, and my heart rate kicked up a notch. Just saying, he continued, his tone starting to change, you don't want to be alone here. Late at night, in an empty store. I froze, his words cutting through the air like a blade. It was a weird thing to say, but I laughed it off, trying to make light of it. Well, you know, it's part of the job. Got to close up the store somehow. I didn't know why I said that. It just came out automatically. But the smile that appeared on his face was no longer friendly. It was tight, almost forced, and the way he looked at me made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Yeah, he said, voice lowering. I bet you do. You better lock the door when I leave, though. Don't want anyone else coming in. I felt a bead of sweat form on my forehead, but I kept my composure. Right. I'll lock it up as soon as you're done. But he didn't move. Instead, he took a step toward me, and something in his posture shifted. He was no longer a normal customer, but something different, something threatening. I don't think you understand, he said, his voice colder now. You shouldn't be working here alone. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but my throat felt tight. I took a small step back, trying to put some distance between us. He noticed. Are you scared? He asked, the edge in his voice now more pronounced. I forced myself to stand my ground, though my mind was racing. Why was he acting like this? I'd let plenty of customers in before without a second thought. What was different about this guy? Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, you've got what you came for. I need to finish closing, and I've got other things to do. So if you're done, I'm not done, he interrupted, his eyes cold. He took another step forward, his body blocking the aisle. I could feel panic starting to creep up on me. I had to stay calm. I had to get through this. I just need to grab one more thing, he said, his voice now almost casual. You know how it is. Always forget something. I nodded, backing up toward the counter. I tried to keep my hands from shaking, but I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. He turned around and walked back to the shelves, his steps slow now, almost deliberate. My hands were shaking, and I felt the tightness in my chest that comes with realizing something is very wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a customer anymore. He was something else. And as he picked up another item, I noticed his eyes flickering to the back door. That's when it hit me. He was planning to make sure I couldn't leave. He wasn't just shopping. He was waiting for me to let my guard down, to let him do whatever it was he planned to do. I started moving toward the back door, trying to keep it casual, but my mind was racing. I had to get out. I had to lock the door. Are you almost done? I asked, my voice a little more frantic than I wanted it to be. He didn't answer right away. He was looking at the item in his hands, then slowly turned to face me. You're not going anywhere, he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to do anything to get away from him. I made a split-second decision and bolted for the back office door, locking it behind me as quickly as I could. I heard him curse under his breath, then heard him walking toward the back, his footsteps echoing through the store. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my hands still shaking as I explained the situation. I stayed in the office, locked inside, until I heard sirens approaching in the distance. When they arrived, the man was nowhere to be found. They said they'd look into the security footage, but honestly, I don't think I'll ever forget the way he looked at me, like I was just another thing to be controlled, another victim in his plans. After that night, I made sure to double-check the locks, always. It's a part of the job now. but I don't take being alone at work for granted anymore. I can't. It started out like a regular stop. I was driving back from a long road trip, somewhere between exhausted and delirious from being in the car for hours. I pulled into a gas station just off the highway, hoping to stretch my legs and grab a drink. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was one of those typical, half-lit, low-key places where you'd stop just to fuel up and keep moving. The pumps were almost empty, with only a couple of other cars scattered around the lot. I parked near the front, ready to top off my tank and grab some snacks. The weather was a little overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel just a bit off. As I walked toward the door of the station, I noticed a man standing near one of the pumps. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a faded red jacket, a cap pulled low over his eyes, and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. He gave me a friendly nod when he saw me, and I instinctively nodded back, though I wasn't really in the mood to chat. I'd been on the road for far too long and just wanted to get back home. But then he said something that made me stop in my tracks. "Hey, man, you look like you could use a wash." I stopped, frowning a little. Was he talking to me? I glanced at my car. It wasn't particularly dirty, but the long trip had left it a little dusty. Not enough to make me want to get a full wash, but enough to make me wonder if maybe it wouldn't hurt. "You sure you don't want a free wash while you're here?" he added. "Ah, free?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yep, free. Just trying to help out people like you on the road. Free wash, no strings attached." Something about it felt a little off, but at the same time, I figured it couldn't hurt. I had some time to kill, and if it was truly free, what was the worst that could happen? "All right," I said, pulling my keys out of my pocket. "Why not?" He gave me a smile that seemed almost too wide, like he was trying a bit too hard to seem friendly. Still, I didn't think much of it. I handed him my keys and started walking toward the convenience store to grab a drink. As I walked in, I could still see the man in my car, opening the door and starting to spray something on the windows. I didn't think it was weird at the time, but I should have been more cautious. It only took a minute before the unease started to creep in. I went straight to the cooler, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked up to the counter. The cashier gave me a look that I could only describe as uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just late and he was tired. But when I paid and turned around to head back outside, something felt wrong. The man with my car was gone. I froze, a chill running down my spine. My car was still there, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I glanced over at the other vehicles parked around the lot, but no one was paying attention. The gas station was still mostly empty. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe he was just washing my car in a different part of the lot. But my gut told me otherwise. I could feel my heart rate picking up. Something wasn't right. I started walking towards the exit, scanning the area for any sign of him. And then I saw it. The car. My car. It was moving. I saw it just as it sped out of the lot, tires screeching as it turned onto the highway. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of lead as the realization hit me. The man had stolen my car. I stood there, staring after it for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It was like a bad dream, something that didn't feel real. I'd been gone for just a few minutes. How could he have taken my car that quickly? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to chase after him, but my legs wouldn't move. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called the police. "They stole my car," I said, my voice trembling. "A man just took my car." I was only inside for a minute. I could hear the dispatcher trying to calm me down, asking for my location and the details of the car. But all I could think about was how quickly it had happened. How had he done it? Was he just waiting for someone to leave their car unattended? Did he know exactly what he was doing? I walked back to the pump, staring at the empty spot where my car had been parked. The whole scene felt surreal. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. They asked me to explain what had happened. I told them everything I could remember, but it didn't seem like much. I'd been inside for maybe 5 minutes, tops. When I came out, the car was gone. One officer asked if there was anything valuable in the car, but I couldn't think of anything in the moment. It wasn't like I had a lot of personal things in there, but I realized I didn't even know what the man had been able to take before he drove off. They asked me to wait while they filed the report. I didn't want to stick around any longer, so I left the station and went back to my hotel, my mind racing the entire time. How had he been able to take my car so easily? Was it a setup? Was it the kind of thing he did every night, preying on tired, unsuspecting drivers? The next day, the police called me to say they found the car abandoned at the side of the road. The thief had left it there, empty. I didn't get the car back until a few days later, after they finished collecting evidence. By then, I'd already canceled my insurance and filed a report with the DMV, assuming the worst. I still think about it sometimes. How easy it was for him to approach me, how quickly he had my car in his possession, and how no one at the gas station seemed to have seen anything. I never did find out who that man was or what he really wanted. Maybe it was just a one-off, maybe it wasn't. But now, every time I stop at a gas station, I'm more cautious. I never let anyone touch my keys unless I'm absolutely sure who they are. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. I didn't think much of it at first, honestly. It seemed like a typical stop, a little roadside stall selling fresh fruits and vegetables. My partner, Emma, and I were on our way back from a weekend road trip to the mountains, and we had been driving for hours. We needed a break, something to stretch our legs, and a small part of me was hoping for some fresh peaches or cherries to snack on as we continued the drive. The stall was tucked away along a quiet stretch of highway, just outside of a small town. It wasn't a particularly busy area, but it was the perfect spot for someone to sell local produce. The man behind the counter looked to be in his late 40s, with a thick gray beard and a weathered face that told the story of a life spent outdoors. He wore a flannel shirt, jeans, and a pair of old boots. Nothing too unusual, nothing that made me suspicious at first. We approached the stand and started browsing. There were baskets of tomatoes, cucumbers, and green beans, and the smell of ripe fruit filled the air. It wasn't anything fancy, but the produce looked fresh, probably picked that morning. Emma was already eyeing a bag of apples when the man spoke up. "Good choice," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "But you know, I've got a much better selection in my place. If you're looking for something real special, I can show you." I turned toward him, half listening, still looking over the apples. "Oh yeah?" I asked, just to be polite. He nodded eagerly, his hands clasped on the counter. I've got all kinds of stuff in my house, peppers, squash, berries, you name it. It's just a little ways down the road. You two look like you've been driving for a while. Might be nice to get a little break and see what I've got." I glanced at Emma, who had stopped looking at the apples and was now staring at the man. She had a strange look on her face, the kind of expression that made me pause. She didn't say anything, though, and I didn't want to overthink it. People make small talk at roadside stands all the time, right? But something about his demeanor rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't anything specific at first, just the way he was leaning forward over the counter, almost too eager. His eyes seemed a little too wide, his smile a little too practiced. "We don't need anything too special, really," I said, trying to brush it off. "We're just looking for a few things to snack on." The man's smile faltered for a second, but then he quickly recovered. "Oh, I understand. But you know, most people don't get to see the good stuff unless they come out to my house. You won't find anything like it anywhere else." I felt Emma's hand on my arm, her fingers tight, like she was silently telling me to hurry up. I looked at her, and there was a nervousness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. She was usually the calm one, the one who made me feel safe, but now she was the one who seemed unsettled. I forced a smile and nodded. "Maybe next time," I said, starting to step back from the stall. But he didn't back off. Instead, he stood up straighter, his expression shifting. It wasn't angry, no, it was something colder, more calculating. He stepped out from behind the counter, his hand still resting casually on the wooden edge. "I'm just trying to offer a little something extra. You two are welcome to come see it, no pressure. It's not far. I'm sure you'll like what I've got." At this point, I could tell Emma was getting nervous. She took a half step backward, trying to distance herself from him. I looked around, but the road was empty. No other cars were parked, and there weren't any other people in sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were alone here, too alone. I wasn't sure what it was, but something about this whole exchange had my spidey senses tingling. "Thanks, but we really should get going," I said, stepping closer to Emma, trying to pull her gently toward the car. The man's smile stayed, but it was different now. It wasn't friendly anymore. It was almost like he knew something we didn't. He took a step toward us, but I held my ground, my hand reaching for Emma's. "You don't need to be so hasty," he said, his voice dropping just a little, and the calm tone seemed to carry a bit more weight now. "I'm just offering some fresh produce, and you two look like you could use a good rest. You could take 5 minutes, maybe. Just a short drive." That was when I felt a real unease flooding through me. My hand tightened around the car keys in my pocket, and I could feel Emma's pulse quicken beside me. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but we're fine. We don't need your help," I said firmly, hoping to end the conversation. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pulling into something that wasn't quite a smile anymore. "I'm just trying to offer a better deal. A good place to stop. You're making a mistake." I could tell then he wasn't just trying to sell us fruit. He was trying to get us somewhere. I don't know what his plan was, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. "We're good, thank you," I said one last time, and I grabbed Emma's hand, leading her toward the car. We didn't look back as we walked quickly, and the whole time, I could feel the man's gaze on us. I opened the door to the car, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door behind me. "Drive," Emma said in a low voice. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. I didn't question it. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking space. As I turned around to head back onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, watching us, his posture stiff. But this time, there was something else in his eyes, something dark, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I didn't tell Emma right away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just narrowly avoided something bad. We didn't talk much for the next few miles, both of us lost in our thoughts. Emma kept glancing at the road behind us, like she expected to see his car following. I was hoping I was just being paranoid, but part of me knew better. It wasn't the first time I'd seen someone who looked harmless at first but then turned out to have much darker intentions. And I wouldn't make that mistake again. I'm just glad we got out of there before it was too late. It started small, just a couple of times. I didn't think much of it at first, honestly. When I moved into this neighborhood, I knew I would eventually meet the people around me. It was a quiet street, a mix of young families, retirees, and single professionals. Everyone mostly kept to themselves, which was fine by me. I like my privacy, and I wasn't interested in becoming too close with anyone. But then I met Margaret, my neighbor from next door. At first, it seemed innocent enough. One evening, I was walking up the stairs to my front door when I saw her standing by her own door. She was a little older than me, in her early 50s, but friendly enough. She waved and came over to chat, something about how she'd noticed me moving in a few weeks ago. We made small talk. She told me she'd lived in the house for over a decade, and I gave her the standard response about being new to the area and trying to settle in. It wasn't long before she asked if I had a can of vegetable oil she could borrow. She said she was in the middle of cooking dinner, and she'd run out. I didn't think twice before I handed it over. "Of course, no problem," I said, handing her the can with a smile. She thanked me and promised to return it the next day. I didn't think anything more about it. That's just the kind of neighborly thing to do, right? The next day, at around 11 p.m., I heard a knock on my door. It was Margaret, holding the can of vegetable oil. "I'm so sorry, it got late," she said with a nervous laugh. "I just wanted to make sure you had it back before the night was over." I wasn't bothered by it. It was late, but she seemed like the type of person who wanted to make things right. "No problem," I said, smiling. "Thanks for bringing it back." Over the next few weeks, things continued like this. It was always something small, a cup of sugar, a set of measuring spoons, a screwdriver. She'd ask if she could borrow them, and most of the time, I'd say yes, thinking she was just being friendly. But then, without fail, she would show up at my door late at night, usually after 10 p.m., to return whatever she'd borrowed. It wasn't just the timing that started to bug me, though. It was the way she behaved when she came over. The first couple of times, it seemed normal enough. She'd knock, I'd answer, she'd give me whatever I had lent her, and we'd exchange pleasantries. But after a while, I noticed a pattern. She started lingering at the door longer than necessary. Just standing there, talking about random things. She'd mention something about her day, ask how my job was going, or bring up the weather in a way that felt almost rehearsed. It was always the same things, and it started to make me uncomfortable. Then came the night when it crossed a line. It was a Thursday, I remember. I had just gotten home from work and was preparing a quick dinner when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I opened it, I was surprised to see Margaret standing there. "Hey," she said with a soft smile. "I know it's late, but I just realized I've run out of tape. Could I borrow some? I'll return it tomorrow, I promise." I sighed, but it wasn't a big deal. I grabbed the tape from the drawer and handed it to her. "No problem," I said, trying to keep the conversation brief. "I've got to finish making dinner." But she didn't leave. She just stood there, almost as if waiting for me to invite her in. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, a little awkwardly. "Ah, well, I hope that helps. Instead of heading back to her own door like I expected, she stepped closer. Actually, she said, her voice low, do you mind if I come in for a second? I just need to use your bathroom real quick. I've been out all day, and I really need to go. Now, this was unusual. I had only known her for a few weeks, and while we'd exchanged pleasantries, I didn't feel comfortable with her coming inside. Oh, I'm actually in the middle of something, I said, hoping she would get the hint. Maybe next time? She smiled, but it wasn't the same warm smile as before. It felt forced, like she was trying too hard to appear casual. No worries. I'll just be quick, she said, before stepping over the threshold before I could stop her. I didn't know how to react. Part of me was saying this was a little too much, inviting herself in like that. But part of me didn't want to make a scene, so I just let it happen. I followed her inside, feeling this uncomfortable tension building in my chest. Margaret went straight to the bathroom without saying much, and I stood in the living room, trying to distract myself. A few moments later, she came out, not having said a word, and returned to the door. Thanks again, she said, her tone a little too casual. I really appreciate it. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Something about her sudden invasion of my space felt off, but I was too tired and too uneasy to say anything. She left quietly, but that night I didn't sleep well. The next few days were more of the same. Small things, small requests, and always returning them later than expected. Each time, she seemed to linger a little longer. The conversations felt forced, the air always thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her visits had become a regular part of my life now, and it was starting to get exhausting. I started avoiding answering the door when I knew she was going to come by. I pretended not to be home, even when I heard her knock. But it wasn't until one night that I realized just how far things had gone. I had just gotten home from a late shift and was exhausted. I barely had the energy to make a cup of tea when there was a knock at the door. I knew it was Margaret, and for once, I was too tired to be polite. I just let the silence stretch on, hoping she'd go away. But then I heard it, just the softest scratch against the door. It was so quiet I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. Then it came again. A small tap, followed by the sound of something sliding across the bottom of the door. I bent down to look. There, just below the crack of the door, was a small envelope with my name written on it in black ink. I opened it carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a note. I think I've overstayed my welcome, it said. I'll be back tonight. Don't worry, I'll leave soon enough. I didn't know what to do. I had never felt so trapped in my own home before. It had been happening for so long that I hadn't even realized how much it had affected me until now. I had never asked Margaret to leave me alone, but I couldn't help but wonder if I had been too passive about it. If I had somehow allowed her to push past my boundaries, even when I didn't want her to. I still haven't figured out what to do about it. I've been locking the door earlier, avoiding her as best I can, but the tension is still there. Margaret still comes by every few days, and I've started noticing strange things, items out of place, things that I didn't borrow or use, and the feeling that someone has been in my house when I wasn't around. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that everything is normal. I don't know what will happen if I tell her to stay away. But I know one thing, I need to do something. Because the longer I wait, the harder it's going to be to make her leave. It was one of those rare afternoons where I had no plans. I just finished a couple of tests at school, and my parents were busy with work, so I decided to head to the mall to pick up a few things. Nothing big, just some new clothes and maybe some books. I'm not really a big shopper, but I figured I'd treat myself a little. The mall was relatively empty for a Friday, which made it feel a bit quieter than usual. I was wandering around the main floor, trying to find a pair of jeans that weren't too expensive but still looked good. It was a typical day. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as I passed by the shoe store, I noticed a group of 3 adults. A man and 2 women, maybe in their 30s or early 40s. They were standing just outside the entrance, looking around. It wasn't the way they were standing that caught my attention, but the way they looked at me. It wasn't like a glance, like you'd expect from a stranger in a public place. No, they were staring at me. It felt wrong, but I tried not to think too much of it. I kept walking, glancing at the shoes in the window. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw them move, and before I knew it, they were standing right in front of me. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice a little too frantic for my taste. "Have you seen a little girl around here?" "About this tall," he motioned with his hand, "dark hair, pink jacket." "She's about 6 or 7. We've been looking everywhere." I don't know why, but something about the way he spoke made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was the fact that they looked calm enough, but there was this strange tension in the air. The man seemed rushed, but not in a way that made me feel like he was genuinely panicking. He was almost too calm. I mean, what kind of parent just walks up to a random teenager in a mall and starts asking about their missing child? No, sorry," I said, shaking my head. "I haven't seen anyone like that." The woman standing beside him nodded, and I thought she looked a little too relieved at my answer. She had this smile that felt forced, like she was trying to be polite but something wasn't quite right. "Thank you. We can't find her anywhere." "She wandered off and we're getting worried," she added, sounding almost rehearsed. The way she said it made me question if they were really parents at all. The other woman, who hadn't spoken yet, stepped forward, looking even more anxious. "We've been searching for a while, and we don't know where else to look." "It's just," she broke off mid-sentence and looked at the man, like they had some silent agreement. Then the man spoke again, his tone suddenly shifting, softer, but still just as urgent. "Hey, would you mind helping us out? We think she might have gone towards the exit, and if you could just check, maybe help us find her. We're not sure where else to go." I'm not sure what made me hesitate, but something did. I stood there, unsure. At that moment, a cold feeling ran through my chest. I glanced around, but the mall was still quiet. No one seemed to be paying attention. Maybe they were just desperate parents, I thought, trying to find their child. But why had they picked me? I should have just walked away. I should have just told them I didn't have time to help. But instead, I nodded. "Okay, I'll look around by the exit." The man smiled, a little too wide, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks. We really appreciate it." They all turned and started walking toward the far end of the mall, not saying anything else. I fell in line behind them. Something in the back of my mind told me that I should be cautious, but my curiosity and guilt took over. I kept thinking that maybe they really were just worried parents. It wasn't until we reached the escalators that I realized how far I'd followed them. The mall exit was on the ground floor, but we were heading toward the back entrance, where the service areas were. The further we walked, the more my unease grew. There were fewer people around, and the lights seemed dimmer in that part of the mall. It felt isolated. The noise of the crowd faded, and suddenly, it was just the 4 of us. The woman in front of me kept looking back, like she was checking to see if I was still there, but she never said anything. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, but as we turned another corner, I realized I didn't even recognize where we were anymore. I stopped in my tracks. "This isn't the exit," I said, my voice a little shakier than I wanted it to be. "I thought we were going to the exit." The man turned, his face unreadable. "Oh, it's just a shortcut. We're close." I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The whole situation was starting to feel wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Why hadn't they just gone to the front exit like any normal person? Why had they led me here? Before I could backtrack, the woman ahead of me stopped and looked over her shoulder at me, her smile vanishing. She took a step closer. "It's just a bit further, don't worry. We'll find her. Just keep going." I started to feel trapped. They were walking so slowly now, and the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. No one was around. The silence was deafening. Something clicked in my mind, and the realization hit me all at once: these weren't parents looking for a lost child. They were luring me somewhere. I didn't know why it took me so long to realize it, but I had to get out of there. I turned quickly and started walking back toward the escalators, but before I could get very far, I heard the man's voice, low and urgent, behind me. "Hey, what's the rush?" he asked, his voice changing. "We're just trying to help you help us." I didn't look back. I just kept walking faster, breaking into a jog as I passed the service doors, heading back toward the main part of the mall. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from them. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my shoulder, pulling me back. My heart raced in my chest, but before I could react, a voice yelled from down the hall. "Security." I turned and saw a mall security guard running toward us. The man immediately let go of my shoulder and stepped back, his expression cold, almost angry. The woman and the other man just stood there, their faces suddenly blank. The security guard was fast, and within moments, they had them surrounded. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran the rest of the way out into the main area of the mall where people were talking and shopping. I could hear the guard calling out, telling me to stay put, but I just needed to get away from them. I never saw those people again, but I was shaken. It took me weeks to feel normal again, to trust that when I saw someone in public asking for help, I wouldn't instantly be reminded of that moment. It wasn't until later, when I was talking to one of my friends, that I realized just how lucky I was. Apparently, there had been a series of similar incidents at local malls over the past few months, people getting lured into quiet, isolated areas and disappearing. No one knew exactly what happened, but I guess I just got out in time. I don't go to that part of the mall anymore. I still think about it sometimes, and I've learned to trust that gut feeling that something's wrong, even if it's just a small voice in the back of my head. It was the one thing that saved me. I wasn't expecting to find anything out of the ordinary that morning. It was just a simple walk through the park. I like going early, before it gets crowded, when the air is still cool and everything feels calm. It's a good way to clear my head. I'm not the type to run or jog, but I enjoy a good, quiet walk with a coffee in hand. The park was pretty much empty that day, save for a couple of joggers in the distance and a few people walking their dogs. The sun had barely risen above the trees, casting a soft light over the benches and paths. It was peaceful, just the way I liked it. I was heading down my usual route near the lake when I saw a backpack sitting on a bench all alone. I've always been the type to look out for lost items, especially in public places. Maybe it's because I know how stressful it can be to lose something important, like a wallet or a phone, and I'd hate for someone to go through that. I walked over to the bench, thinking I'd find something innocuous. Maybe some school books or a jacket someone had forgotten. But when I picked it up, I noticed how heavy it felt. Not just heavy, though it felt odd. There was something about it that made me pause. The straps were perfectly aligned, and it was sitting so neatly on the bench that it didn't look like it had been casually discarded. It almost seemed like someone had placed it there intentionally. I figured I'd check inside, just to make sure it was truly abandoned, and there wasn't anything personal in it. Maybe there was a wallet or ID so I could contact the owner. The zipper was a little stiff, but it opened easily enough. Inside, I found a few things that seemed normal: a water bottle, a couple of notebooks, some snacks, nothing unusual. But then I saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a small, unmarked envelope at the bottom. It wasn't sealed, just folded over once. I pulled it out cautiously, trying not to get too curious. I didn't want to pry, but I couldn't help but wonder what it was. As I unfolded it, I noticed the handwriting on the front neat, almost professional looking. It didn't say anything except for a name, Jonas. The name didn't mean anything to me, but still, something about it made me feel uncomfortable. I'm not sure why, but I quickly folded the envelope back up and placed it back into the bag. The rest of the items seemed entirely ordinary, so I decided to take the backpack to the Lost and Found, as I usually do when I find something like this. I stood up to leave the bench, holding the bag by the straps, when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey! That's mine. What are you doing with my bag?" I turned around, startled. A man, probably in his mid-30s, was standing a few feet away. He was tall, wearing a black hoodie and sweatpants. His expression was tense, and he was staring right at me, his eyes hard. I froze for a moment, confused. Sorry, I didn't mean to take it," I said, holding up the bag. "I found it here on the bench." I was going to take it to the Lost and Found. The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, that's my bag. You're stealing it. Give it back." I blinked, thrown off by his response. "What? No, I'm not stealing it." "Give it back," he interrupted, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of the few people walking by. "That's my property. You can't just take things that aren't yours." I tried to stay calm, still holding the bag out in front of me. "Look, I wasn't trying to steal it. I found it on the bench, and I was just going to turn it in." The man took another step forward, closing the distance between us. His face had become flushed, his eyes wild. "No, it's mine. You don't know what's in there, but it's mine. You have to return it." I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me was starting to feel a little intimidated, but at the same time, something didn't sit right with me about his behavior. Why was he acting so frantic? People don't usually get that worked up over a bag, especially if they've left it unattended. But I wasn't going to give him the bag without some explanation. "I'm not giving it to you without knowing why you're so upset," I said, my voice steady, but a little more firm now. "If it's really yours, you can take it to the Lost and Found and prove it." His face twisted into a scowl. "I'm not going to the Lost and Found. I want it now. Just give it to me." The way he was acting made me uneasy. It was as though he wasn't just upset about losing a bag, there was something deeper behind it. Something more desperate. I tried to step back, thinking maybe I could walk away without any more confrontation, but as soon as I moved, the man took a step toward me again. "Hey," he shouted. "Give it to me. You have no right to take it." His voice had started to raise to an almost shouting level, and I could see some of the people walking past us now turning to look. I didn't want a scene, and I didn't want to provoke him further, but I also didn't want to hand the bag over to someone who might not be the rightful owner. I glanced around, hoping someone might step in, but the few people nearby were just standing there, watching. "I'm just going to take it to the lost and found," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. The man's expression twisted with fury, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge at me. Instead, he stepped back, taking a deep breath like he was trying to control his anger. "You don't know what you're messing with," he said, almost to himself. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. What did that even mean? Was this just some crazy guy, or was there something more sinister going on? My heart was racing now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. He stepped back again, eyes never leaving me, and then he said something that sent a shiver through me. "You don't understand. You have to return what's mine." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the park. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what had just happened. I thought about following him, reporting him, or maybe just finding a police officer. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no solid proof he was even the rightful owner of the bag. I didn't know if it was his or not. And I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had handed it over to him, something worse might have happened. I decided not to take any chances. Instead of going straight to the lost and found, I left the park and went to a nearby cafe to sit for a while, trying to calm down. I left the backpack in the back seat of my car, unsure of what to do next. I never went back to that park. I never saw that man again, but every time I pass that bench, I can't shake the feeling that I missed something important. And part of me wonders what was in that bag. What did he want so badly that he was willing to make such a scene? I can't help but think it was something more than just a simple backpack. It started as a normal drive. I had to head out of town for a work meeting, and since it was a long distance, I decided to use the GPS to make things easier. The route it gave me looked fine, a few rural roads here and there, but nothing that would raise any alarms. I'd been down these kinds of roads before, and I wasn't too worried about it. I'd been on the highway for about an hour, just getting into a quieter part of the countryside when the GPS instructed me to take a right turn onto a narrow road. The road was a little bumpy at first, and I thought maybe it was just a small stretch that would lead to a better road, but as I kept going, it became clear this wasn't the case. It was one of those old back roads with no streetlights, surrounded by overgrown trees and thick brush. The pavement was cracked and uneven, barely wide enough for 2 cars. But there were no signs of construction, no detours. It was just one of those forgotten roads that didn't seem to serve any particular purpose. I glanced at the GPS again. It showed that I was still on the right track, but the road seemed to get more desolate the further I went. The occasional farmhouse or old barn passed by, but there were no other cars. I felt a little uneasy, but nothing that would make me panic. I had driven in rural areas before. It was just a quiet part of the world, and I was probably overthinking it. About 10 minutes into this, I noticed a car behind me. It was a black SUV, not too far behind, but I hadn't heard it coming. I figured it was just another traveler, maybe going to the same place. The thing was, the car was driving much too close to mine. I thought about speeding up a little to give myself some space, but the road didn't allow for much room. There was barely enough space for 2 cars to drive side by side. I didn't want to make any sudden moves, so I just kept going, hoping the driver would eventually pull around me. But the car didn't pass. It stayed there, right on my tail, getting even closer. I could see the headlights in my rearview mirror, and it started to make me uncomfortable. It was getting late, and the road was getting narrower. I didn't know why this person was tailgating me. I couldn't think of any reason why someone would need to be that close, especially on a road this deserted. I tried to maintain my speed, but the car kept inching closer. It felt almost deliberate, like they were trying to push me to move faster. I glanced at the side of the road, but there was nowhere to pull over. It was just trees, ditches, and fields. My heart started to race. I didn't know why I felt so uneasy, but something about the whole situation was off. Then, without warning, the car behind me flashed its high beams. I jumped a little, startled by the sudden burst of light. The road was already poorly lit, and I couldn't see much ahead of me as it was. I squinted into the mirror, hoping the driver would back off. But instead, the SUV stayed right behind me, its lights blinding me now. It felt aggressive, like the person wanted me to pull over. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. What should I do? I couldn't stop in the middle of nowhere with this person right behind me. If I pulled over, would they stop too? Would they do something? I decided to speed up a little, hoping to get out of whatever this situation was. I hit the gas and pushed forward, but as I did, the SUV did the same. It accelerated, matching my speed, almost as if it was trying to push me further down the road. I made another quick check of the GPS. I was still on the right path, but there was no sign of a turn or any exit for several miles. My stomach dropped. This road seemed to go on forever. At that moment, the car behind me slammed on its horn, loud and sudden. It echoed through the trees, sharp and demanding. I wasn't sure if it was meant to scare me or force me into some kind of action, but I had to do something. I glanced to the side again, but there was still nowhere to go. Then it happened. The SUV moved to the side of my car, pushing just a little too close. I could see the black grille of the vehicle in my peripheral vision. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I couldn't speed up anymore, there wasn't enough room. Without warning, the SUV swerved in front of me, blocking my way. I slammed on the brakes, barely avoiding rear-ending them. The car in front of me slowed, almost stopping altogether. My hands were shaking as I slammed my hand down on the horn. I didn't know what they were planning, but this was clearly no accident. The SUV stayed there for a moment, as if waiting for me to make the next move. My mind raced. What should I do? I was trapped on this narrow road with no options. I was too far away from any towns, and there were no streetlights in sight. I couldn't just turn around, there wasn't enough room. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. Then, as I sat there, frozen for a second, the SUV suddenly sped off down the road, just as fast as it had appeared. It didn't stop to look back, didn't give me a chance to react. It was like they'd done what they needed to do, whatever that was, and then left without a word. I stayed there, my car still idling, my mind racing. What just happened? I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like I couldn't get air in my lungs. I kept thinking about the whole thing, the aggressive tailgating, the sudden maneuvering. It didn't make any sense. They could have passed me. They didn't need to get that close. After what felt like an eternity, I started the car again, keeping my eyes on the road. The SUV was nowhere in sight. I drove the rest of the way in a daze, my thoughts swirling with confusion and a lingering sense of danger. I finally reached the main road, where the streetlights were bright, and everything felt safer. But the image of that SUV, the way it moved and the way it forced me off the road, stayed with me. I still don't know what it was all about. Was it just some road rage incident? Or was there something more? What would have happened if I hadn't been able to slow down in time? To this day, I don't take those back roads anymore. I'm not sure what it was, but I still get this uneasy feeling every time I drive through unfamiliar areas. The whole thing was too close to something bad happening, and I can't shake the feeling that I dodged something dangerous that day. It was one of those quiet nights where the world feels a little too still. I had just gotten home from work, and my dog, Max, was practically bouncing off the walls, ready for his evening walk. I didn't mind, it was peaceful outside, and honestly, I looked forward to the fresh air after a long day. I put on my jacket, clipped Max's leash to his collar, and we set off down the street. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and there's hardly ever any real danger. It's the sort of place where you can take a late night walk without worrying about much. I'd done it 100 times before, just me and Max, circling the block. The lights in the houses were mostly off, the streetlights casting long shadows along the sidewalk. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and Max's excited panting beside me. But tonight, something felt a little different. We had just passed the end of the block when I first noticed him. A man walking a few paces behind me. I hadn't heard him approach, but when I turned my head, I saw him. He wasn't walking aggressively or in any particular hurry. In fact, he seemed to be just walking at a normal pace, but his movements were too deliberate. As if he was making sure to keep just far enough behind that I wouldn't feel directly threatened. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a public street, after all. It was normal to pass someone on a walk, and maybe he just happened to be out for a stroll too. I continued walking, trying not to pay attention to the nagging feeling at the back of my mind. Max tugged on his leash, sniffing at the bushes along the sidewalk, and I focused on him, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. But after a few more steps, I glanced over my shoulder again. The man hadn't changed his position. He was still behind me, but now he was just far enough that I couldn't see his face clearly, only the outline of his body under the dim streetlights. He wasn't speeding up or slowing down. It was almost as if he was just keeping his distance. I started to feel uneasy. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just another late-night walker, like me. But the longer I walked, the more I noticed him. Every time I looked back, he was there, always keeping the same distance between us. It was like he was pacing me, moving at the exact same speed, staying just out of sight whenever I tried to glance over my shoulder. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing, right? People walked at night all the time. But why hadn't he passed me? If he had been out for a walk like I was, wouldn't he have walked faster or overtaken me by now? I quickened my pace, hoping that he would either pass me or stop following me. But as soon as I did, he did the same. His pace matched mine, keeping that same careful distance. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. This didn't feel like a random person out for a walk anymore. It felt like he was intentionally staying behind me. Max seemed to sense my change in mood. He started to pull harder on his leash, looking back nervously at the man behind us. That only made me more anxious. I kept walking, trying to calm Max down, but now every step felt heavier, like the air around me was thickening with unease. I reached the corner of the block and decided to turn. I figured that maybe he was just walking in a circle, like I often did. But when I turned, he turned too. It wasn't a coincidence. He had stayed directly behind me and now, without breaking stride, followed my change of direction. It was like he was making sure we stayed on the same path. At that point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I stopped walking abruptly, pretending to adjust Max's leash, trying to force a look back without being too obvious. Sure enough, the man had stopped too. He was still standing at the same spot, just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look at his face, but he was watching me. He hadn't been walking toward a destination. He had been following me. He was watching me. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. What was I supposed to do? Should I confront him? Or should I keep walking and hope he would leave me alone? But I didn't want to take any chances. I decided to do the one thing I had avoided doing, cut through the park behind my block. It was a shortcut, and it would take me away from the street and out of sight. I turned sharply, heading for the park entrance, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, quickening just a little, matching my speed. My heart skipped a beat. It was like he was reacting to my decision to change direction. I didn't look back this time. I just kept walking, my legs moving faster, feeling a sense of panic rising in my chest. Max was now pulling on the leash harder than ever, his ears back, his body tense. I reached the park and didn't look back again. Instead, I focused on the path ahead, the familiar trees lining the edges of the walkway. There were fewer lights here, but it was a more direct route home. But as I entered the park, I heard something that made my blood run cold, footsteps behind me. Faster now. Not just matching my pace, but speeding up. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. I didn't dare look back, but I knew he was there. I could hear him closing the distance, the sound of his footfalls getting louder. I couldn't risk it. I could feel the fear creeping up on me, tightening in my chest. I broke into a run. Max, who had been picking up on my panic, barked loudly and ran with me, his paws pounding on the pavement. My heart raced as I sprinted through the park, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could only hear him now, his footsteps too close, the sound of them matching mine in a disturbing rhythm. It was as though he had anticipated my every move. I was almost to the other side of the park when I heard the unmistakable sound of him speeding up even more. Just as I neared the exit, I glanced over my shoulder. The man was right there, only a few feet behind me. I didn't think, I just pushed myself harder, desperate to get out of the park and back onto the main road. Finally, I saw the familiar glow of streetlights ahead, and I bolted for them, my legs burning, Max barking wildly beside me. I didn't look back once I hit the street. I just kept running, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me with every step. When I finally reached the safety of my front door, I stopped, panting, trying to gather myself. I looked back toward the park. There was no sign of him anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling. He had been there, watching me, following me in the shadows. And even though I didn't see him again that night, the unease lingered. It stayed with me, a reminder of how quickly things can turn when something doesn't feel right. I don't walk late at night anymore. Not after that. I work as a handyman, mostly doing odd jobs for rental properties around the city. Most of my work is pretty standard, fixing leaky faucets, repairing drywall, and replacing light fixtures. Nothing ever out of the ordinary. That is, until I got a call about a new property that needed some attention. The landlord was an older guy, one of those quiet types who never seemed to have much to say. He was friendly enough, but I could tell there was something a little off about the place. The property was an old house, maybe 100 years old or so. It had a certain charm to it, with its creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper. The landlord had mentioned that the house had been vacant for a while, but that it was now ready to rent out. He just needed me to go in, check a few things, and make sure everything was in working order before the new tenants arrived. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another job. But there was one thing that stuck with me from the start, the basement door. I didn't think much of it at first, just another door in the house, but when I went down to the basement to check the furnace, I noticed something strange. The door was locked. No big deal, right? You expect some doors to be locked in older houses. But when I asked the landlord about it, he seemed to get uncomfortable. "Ah, the basement, it's nothing. Just some old stuff down there," he said, brushing it off. I wouldn't worry about it. That was the first red flag. He didn't really give me a solid answer, and there was something about the way he said it that felt off. I figured maybe he was just one of those people who didn't want to deal with the old stuff lying around in the basement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. I went about my work, but that door kept gnawing at the back of my mind. I checked the rest of the house, made the repairs, and kept coming back to that locked door in the basement. Something about it felt wrong, like it was hiding something. I didn't want to pry, but my curiosity kept growing. A couple of weeks went by, and the house was ready to rent. The landlord came by to inspect my work, and everything seemed fine. But I couldn't stop thinking about that locked basement door. I made a mental note to bring it up again, but when I did, the landlord just waved it off. "It's nothing. Don't worry about it," he repeated, almost too quickly. That was when I decided to just let it go. I figured the house was his, and if he didn't want to talk about the basement, it wasn't my place to ask. But deep down, I still couldn't stop thinking about that door. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me. It just felt like there was something hidden behind it, something the landlord didn't want anyone to know. Then, a few days ago, it happened. I got another call from the landlord. He needed me to come by the house to fix a couple of things, nothing major, just a few minor repairs. I was there working when I noticed that something was different. The basement door was no longer locked. The lock was broken. I'm not sure when it happened, but the door was now wide open. I stood there for a second, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to go down there. I had never been down there before, and the thought of it made my stomach turn. But at the same time, I couldn't resist. Something inside me told me I needed to see what was behind that door. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox and headed down the stairs into the basement. The air was damp, and the smell of mold hit me immediately. The basement was dark, just a faint light from the staircase casting shadows on the walls. I stepped forward, scanning the room with my flashlight. The space was filled with old furniture, boxes, and what looked like a bunch of junk, nothing too unusual for a basement. But then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the floorboards creaking, but then I heard it again. A soft sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, holding my breath. The air felt colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a few cautious steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer to the corner, I could hear the sound more clearly now. It wasn't a whisper. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. My heart skipped a beat. I turned my head slowly, scanning the dark corner of the basement. The flashlight beam flickered for a moment, and I swore I saw something move, just a shadow, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I took another step forward, then stopped. My mind was racing, and I felt my stomach turn. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what was down here anymore. The breathing was still there, and it was getting louder, like whatever or whoever was in that corner was getting closer. I couldn't leave. I couldn't just walk away, not after all this. I had to find out what was going on. So, with my heart pounding in my chest, I took one more step forward. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a small door. I hadn't noticed it before. It was a simple wooden door, nothing special about it, but there was something unsettling about it. The sound of breathing was louder now, more distinct, and it was coming from behind that door. It sounded like someone was inside, waiting. I could feel my palms start to sweat, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. I knew I should turn back. I knew I should just get out of there and never come back. But something was pulling me toward that door, some primal curiosity that I couldn't ignore. Slowly, I reached out and placed my hand on the door. The wood was cold under my fingers, and the moment I touched it, the breathing stopped. The silence was deafening. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with what I should do next. Then, without thinking, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was small, barely big enough for a person to stand in, and the air inside was thick with dust and mildew. But what stood out the most was what was in the middle of the room, a chair. A worn, old chair, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the straps, the ones tied to the arms and legs of the chair. And the blood. The dark, sticky stains on the floor beneath it. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the room, trying to process what I was seeing. My body felt numb, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who had been down here? And why had the landlord never told me about this? Then, from behind me, I heard the creak of the basement door. Someone was coming down the stairs. I turned, my heart racing, the flashlight clutched in my hand like it was some kind of weapon. But the basement was empty. The door was closed. My stomach twisted as I realized that whoever or whatever had been in that basement with me wasn't gone. It was still there. And it was watching me. I never imagined my college experience would take a turn like this. I mean, who does? You're 19, away from home for the first time, living in a shared dorm room with someone you barely know, trying to figure out classes, friends, everything. But what I experienced was something I'll never forget. Something I wish I could erase from my memory, but I can't. I met my roommate, Lauren, during orientation. She seemed like a decent person, quiet but friendly. We bonded over the usual small talk, where we were from, what we wanted to study, all that. She was into psychology, and I was in the art program, which I thought was interesting, but we didn't have that much in common. Still, she seemed cool enough. She was always polite, a little reserved, but that wasn't anything unusual for someone trying to adjust to dorm life. At first, things were normal. We had our own space in the room, set up our sides, and generally kept to ourselves. But as time went on, I started noticing little things that made me uneasy. They weren't major at first, just small quirks. Lauren would lock the door whenever she came into the room, even if I was already there. If I asked her about it, she'd just say she felt safer that way. I thought it was odd, but didn't give it much thought. Everyone has their things, right? As weeks passed, those little things became harder to ignore. She started coming back to the room later and later at night. Sometimes, I wouldn't hear her coming until after midnight. When I'd ask where she'd been, she'd smile and tell me she was out studying at the library. But I could never recall seeing her at the library, or really anywhere on campus. She didn't hang out with other people, didn't go to parties, just went silent for hours and then reappeared, like nothing had happened. It didn't help that the whole time she avoided making eye contact when she spoke. She would look down or off to the side, always like she was hiding something. One evening, I had an early class and got back before her, so I decided to get some work done. It wasn't unusual for her to leave her things around, books, notes, and stuff, but today, I noticed something I'd never seen before, a small, wooden trunk tucked under the bed. I had no idea where it had come from. We didn't have trunks or storage containers like that in our room. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe it was just something she brought from home. But then I saw the key. It was on top of the trunk, just sitting there. A plain, old-fashioned key. I don't know why, but something about it felt off. I knew I shouldn't have touched it. I knew that, but for whatever reason, I couldn't stop myself. I picked it up and walked over to the trunk. I had a split-second debate with myself. I had no reason to go through her things. But then again, I didn't know her well enough to trust her fully. Maybe I was just curious. I don't know. I unlocked the trunk. The lid creaked open slowly, revealing a pile of stuff. At first, it just looked like clothes and some books. But as I started to dig deeper, my heart sank. There were items I recognized, things that belonged to other people on our floor. A scarf I'd seen Mia from down the hall wear every day. A pair of sunglasses I knew belonged to Mark. A notebook that had been in Jessica's bag, one I'd seen her working on in the common room. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the notes. Tucked between the clothes and the scattered items were several yellowed pieces of paper, each covered in neat, tiny handwriting. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. It was like a list, names, descriptions, observations. Each note was detailed, listing things like wears red jacket on Mondays or always sits alone in the dining hall. The handwriting was so precise, so deliberate. But what made my stomach turn was that some of these notes included personal details that no one could know unless they had been really watching every move these people made. I could feel the blood draining from my face as I read. The more I read, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Lauren hadn't been at the library all those nights. She hadn't been out studying. She had been watching us. She had been watching everyone in the dorm, taking notes, keeping track of what we did, what we wore, where we went. She had been stalking us. I shut the trunk with shaking hands, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I didn't know what to do. What was I supposed to do? Tell someone? Go to the authorities? But what if I was overreacting? What if there was a perfectly innocent explanation for all of this? I needed to know more. I needed to understand. But I couldn't bring myself to open that trunk again. It felt like Pandora's box, and once you open it, you can't close it. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I left it there and decided to watch Lauren, see if I could piece together what was really going on. The next few days were a blur. I kept thinking about the trunk, about the notes. I watched Lauren, trying to figure out how deep this went. She was quieter than usual, always in her own head, as if she knew I was onto her. But she didn't say anything. She didn't act like she knew I had seen anything. Then came the night when I had to leave for a late study session. I had some things I needed to finish, but when I stepped out of the room, I noticed something that made my heart race. Lauren wasn't there. Her bed was untouched, but her trunk was gone. Panic set in immediately. Where did she go with it? Why would she take it? I didn't have time to think about it. I had to act. So, I grabbed my phone and sent a message to a friend, asking them to keep an eye on Lauren's room. I didn't know what I thought they could do, but I needed to know if she came back. The hours dragged on. I didn't hear anything from my friend, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the time I got back to my dorm, I was expecting to find everything back to normal. But I was wrong. The door to our room was ajar. My heart skipped a beat, and I pushed it open slowly. Lauren wasn't there, but the trunk was. It was back, sitting right where it had been, the lock securely fastened. But there was something different. Something was off. I took a few steps closer and noticed that the papers were gone. The notes, the lists of names and personal details, they were all missing. The trunk was empty now, except for a single piece of paper left on top of the clothes. I picked it up with trembling hands. On it was just one sentence written in Lauren's neat handwriting. I know you know. I didn't know what to do anymore. I had no idea who she really was or what she was capable of. But that note, that single line, made one thing clear. She was watching me now. I wasn't sure what I was expecting when I checked into the hotel. It was a last-minute booking after a long day of travel, and honestly, I was just looking forward to getting some sleep. I'd been on the road for nearly 12 hours and my body was aching. So when I arrived at the hotel, I didn't really pay much attention to the details. I grabbed my room key and made my way up to the third floor, expecting to just crash and forget about the world for a few hours. The room was pretty standard for a mid-range hotel, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a small desk, a TV that I wasn't going to use, and a bathroom that was far too small for my liking. But at that point, I didn't care. I was just glad to have a roof over my head for the night. I locked the door behind me, unpacked a few things, and threw myself on the bed. The hotel was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest, but I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I figured most of the other guests were already asleep. I set my alarm for an early start the next day, and I pulled the covers up, sinking into the warmth of the bed. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I was exhausted, and the comfort of the hotel bed quickly lulled me into a deep, dreamless slumber. The first thing that woke me up was the sound of my door unlocking. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. But then, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock, followed by a soft click. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't ordered room service, and I hadn't told anyone I was in town, so why would someone be unlocking my door at this hour? I listened, straining to hear any sounds, but everything was eerily quiet. I told myself it was probably just the hotel staff. Maybe they were checking something, doing a routine check, or maybe it was a mistake. They could have been given the wrong room key by mistake. But that didn't explain why the door opened. I was too scared to move, but my curiosity pushed me to inch closer to the door. I could hear soft footsteps, almost hesitant. The door cracked open just a little more, and I could see the shadow of someone standing in the hallway. Then the door opened all the way. A man stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. He looked disoriented, like he'd just woken up himself. He was holding a room key, and he looked down at it, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I think there's been a mistake. I was given this room key at the front desk. I'm supposed to be in here." I sat up in bed, blinking in disbelief. What? The man took a step into the room. His clothes were disheveled, as though he'd been traveling or just got out of bed. His hair was messy, and he had that look on his face, the one people get when they don't quite know what's going on. I could see him glancing around the room, clearly confused. "I'm really sorry," he repeated. "They must have given me the wrong key." I stared at him, still trying to process what was happening. My first instinct was to get up, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something about the way he stood there, looking like he didn't belong, made me feel like I was the one who didn't belong in the room. I should have said something, called the front desk, but the words didn't come out. "You're sure you're in the right room?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd gotten confused. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he just made a mistake. But even as I asked, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with the key in his hand. He looked over at me again, his face a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "They told me this was where I was supposed to be." There was an odd hesitation in his voice, something off. And yet, there was this genuine, almost apologetic tone in the way he spoke. Something felt wrong. I quickly glanced at the door, then back at the man. It all felt surreal. Why would he walk into a room at this hour, acting so casual about it? Why didn't he immediately apologize and leave when he realized his mistake? "Okay, I think you need to go back downstairs," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I'm not sure what happened, but... Before I could finish, the man stepped further into the room, his presence blocking the doorway. He didn't push past me, but he didn't move either. He stood there, still holding the key, staring at me as if he was processing something. The more I looked at him, the more I realized how out of place he seemed. I tried to stand up, but something stopped me. The room felt smaller now, almost like the walls were closing in. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that kept growing. My hand reached for my phone on the bedside table, but I was too slow. "I'm really sorry," the man said again, his eyes never leaving mine. "I didn't mean to intrude. But this is my room, right?" I swallowed hard. My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. Something about the way he asked that question, it was like he didn't even care whether he was supposed to be there or not. I finally found my voice. "No, it's not. I've been here all night. I'm the one staying here." I reached for my phone again, this time with more urgency. But the man took a step forward, and I froze. "No, it's fine," he said quickly, his tone suddenly shifting. There was a forced calmness to his voice now, almost too calm. "It's just a mistake. I'll go down and get it sorted out. I'm really sorry." But he didn't move. For a few seconds, we just stood there, eye to eye, in that silent space between us. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt deliberate. "All right," I said, slowly, my voice shaky. "I'm calling the front desk now." I held my phone up, but the man suddenly snapped out of his daze and backed away from me. His expression shifted again, his eyes darting around the room as if realizing how far he'd crossed the line. "Yeah, of course," he mumbled, his voice quiet, almost as if he wasn't sure of himself anymore. I'll go get this fixed." And just like that, he turned, walking out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. I waited a few moments, my heart still racing, before I picked up the phone and dialed the front desk. The person on the other end answered quickly, sounding cheerful. "Front desk, how can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. there's been a mistake. Someone just walked into my room with a key. They said it was the same key I was given, but there's no way that's possible. Can you double-check the room assignments for me?" There was a brief pause. "Of course," the clerk replied, her voice suddenly more businesslike. "Give me one moment." She came back to the phone, her tone much more serious now. "I'm sorry, but according to our system, there's no record of anyone being assigned that room key tonight. Are you sure the person you spoke to was from the hotel?" I didn't have the words to explain what I was feeling. The man had seemed so convincing, so sure of himself. But now, after hearing that, the whole situation felt even stranger. Why had he been so confident that he belonged there? Why didn't he leave when I asked him to? I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been awake. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been alert enough to hear the door unlock. But I do know one thing now: I'll never look at hotels the same way again. Every time I close my hotel room door, I wonder who else might be on the other side. It was one of those nights where everything felt still, too still. I was driving home after visiting a friend out of town, and the drive back was taking longer than I expected. The roads were empty, and I was already tired. I kept glancing at the clock on my dashboard, 12:45 a.m. I wasn't too far from home, but I still had another 30 minutes of driving ahead of me, and I could feel my eyes getting heavy. The headlights of my car illuminated the dark road ahead, and the occasional streetlight cast long shadows on the pavement. I had driven this route a dozen times before, and it always felt like a quiet, peaceful drive. I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. But then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A car parked on the side of the road. Its hazard lights were blinking in the darkness, cutting through the quiet like a warning. It was an older model, something I couldn't quite place, parked halfway off the shoulder. There was no one else around, just me and this car. At first, I thought maybe it had broken down. I didn't want to pass by and ignore someone who might need help. I didn't think twice. I wasn't in a rush, and I wasn't scared of being on this road alone. I thought if I could help, why not? I slowed down, then pulled over a few feet behind the car. I checked my rearview mirror to make sure no one was speeding up behind me. When I glanced at the car, I saw a figure through the foggy windshield, sitting behind the wheel. The car's engine was off, but the hazard lights were still on. I wasn't sure if the person had seen me, so I turned off my engine and got out of the car. I made my way toward the driver's side, trying to appear as friendly as possible. I wasn't nervous, just someone stopping to do the right thing. That's how I felt. As I walked closer, the driver rolled down the window. He was a man, maybe in his 30s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. His face looked tired, but not frantic. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, trying to gauge his situation. "Yeah," he said, with a sigh that almost sounded rehearsed. "Just had some engine trouble. My car just stopped running. I think it's the alternator or something. I don't really know much about cars, though. You wouldn't happen to have a jumper cable, would you?" I paused, not sure what to make of it. It wasn't too late, but it wasn't the kind of thing I'd expect to happen on this road. "I'm not sure I have one on me. I can call someone for you, though, if you'd like." "A tow truck or roadside assistance?" He looked relieved, but there was a strange glimmer in his eyes, almost like he was waiting for something. "I'd appreciate that," he said quickly. "I can't really stay out here too long. It's kind of sketchy. I don't want anyone else pulling up, you know?" I nodded, thinking it made sense. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, ready to make a quick call to the roadside assistance service I had on speed dial. But as I unlocked my phone and started to dial, I heard something. A soft crunching noise. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I looked up, the driver was staring at me through his open window. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. "Hey, just one more thing," he said, his voice suddenly quieter. "Could you maybe back up a little bit? I don't want you to get in the way while I get this fixed. You can just wait in your car for a minute, yeah? I'll be fine." I didn't see why not. It was a bit odd, but I figured he was just trying to make space. I backed up a few steps, moving toward my car, but something didn't feel right. The man didn't seem to be in any real distress. It was the way he kept looking at me, like he wasn't worried about the car but was more focused on me. I glanced over at my car, then back at the man, and I saw him quickly glance over his shoulder. I didn't think much of it at first, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was starting to get a bad feeling. That's when I heard it. A soft tap on the rear of my car. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself it was just a branch brushing against the bumper, but when I turned my head, I saw someone moving behind my car. My heart dropped into my stomach. There was another man. He was creeping along the back of my vehicle, too quietly for me to hear his footsteps until he was almost at the side. My mind started racing. Was he waiting for me to turn around? Was this some kind of setup? I should have listened to that voice inside me that had told me not to stop in the first place. I quickly reached for the door handle to get back into my car, but before I could even pull the door open, the man who had been behind the wheel of the car stepped out and walked toward me. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice shaky now. I couldn't stop glancing between him and the shadowy figure moving behind me. My hand was already on the door handle, but I wasn't sure I could make it in time. "I told you to wait in the car," the man said, his tone shifting. It was less friendly now, more demanding, like he had changed his mind. His body language was different, too. He was standing taller now, and the friendly, helpless attitude he had moments ago was gone. I didn't answer. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, fast and heavy. I had to act. I had to get away. I swung open the door and jumped into the front seat, locking the door behind me. Before I could start the engine, the man came around to the driver's side. He knocked on the window. His expression had completely changed. There was no more tiredness in his eyes, no more pretending. His face was cold, his lips barely moving as he said, "You shouldn't have done that. You should have stayed out here." I couldn't move. I just stared at him through the glass. I could see the other man was now at the back of my car, his hand pressed against the trunk, his face hidden in the shadows. I felt paralyzed, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out of there now. My hand was shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas before I even fully had the car in gear. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes focused on the road. I didn't care how fast I was going. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a gas station up ahead, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I can still hear the sound of their footsteps in my head sometimes. The soft crunch of gravel, the way the man had knocked on my window as I locked myself inside. It all felt like a setup from the start. I don't know what they were planning, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. It started with the scratching noises. It was subtle at first, almost like the sound of mice or squirrels scurrying around in the walls. I remember lying in bed one night, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint scratching sound from above. I brushed it off as nothing. We just moved into this old house a few months ago, and I assumed the creaks and groans of a house settling were just part of the charm. The first few weeks were uneventful, other than the occasional noise. But as time went on, it got worse. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was like something was moving around up there. You know that sound when you shift furniture or when something heavy drags across a floor? It started happening every night, at the same time. I didn't want to alarm my family, so I just shrugged it off. After all, we were in an old house. Pests were common, right? We dealt with some mice in the kitchen already, so it wasn't that big of a leap to think it might be something similar. Maybe a raccoon or squirrels had found a way into the attic. It wasn't the most pleasant thought, but it seemed harmless enough. One evening, about 3 weeks after we moved in, I was sitting in the living room with my husband, Dan, when we both heard the noise again. This time, it was louder, and it was followed by what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. We both froze. "That doesn't sound like mice," Dan said, looking up at the ceiling. I shook my head. "No, that's something else." We had a discussion about it, and I finally convinced Dan that we needed to check it out. But, of course, we didn't want to deal with the mess of trying to get rid of an animal or something even worse up there, so we called an exterminator. They came out the next day and checked the attic. After a thorough inspection, the guy told us there were no signs of pests. No droppings, no chewed wires, nothing. He even said he couldn't find a single entrance point where animals could have gotten in. Dan and I were both relieved, but also a little unnerved. We hadn't imagined the noises. They were real, and now we were left with no explanation. Days passed, and the noises continued. Sometimes, they were soft like the rustling of fabric or something light brushing against the floor. Other times, it was more distinct, the sound of something heavy moving or even knocking. It was as if someone was up there, just walking around or making noise for no reason. But no one was up there. We began to avoid the attic altogether. There was no need to go up there anyway. It wasn't like we used it for anything. The only thing up there were old boxes from the previous owners, things they hadn't bothered to take when they moved out. Every time I'd hear a thump or a shuffle above, I'd just chalk it up to our imagination. But then things started to escalate. One night, around midnight, I was woken up by the sound of something hitting the floor upstairs. It was a loud, thudding noise that echoed throughout the house. Dan woke up, too, and we both lay there, listening. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, faint at first, like something being dragged across the floor, but then it got louder, more deliberate. I couldn't take it anymore. "Dan, we have to go check the attic," I said, my voice shaky with fear. Dan hesitated, looking up at the ceiling. "Maybe we should call the police." "I don't know what's going on, but I don't like it." I agreed. We didn't know what was happening, but we had to do something. We got up and grabbed a flashlight. As we climbed the stairs to the attic, the noise grew more distinct. It wasn't just dragging anymore. It sounded like something or someone was moving around up there, pacing back and forth. When we reached the attic door, Dan hesitated. The door was locked. That was odd. The previous owners had told us they hadn't locked it. It was just a wooden door with a simple latch, and we didn't even have a key for it. "Do you think someone's been up here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dan didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at the locked door. Then, without saying a word, he grabbed the latch and pulled. The door creaked open slowly, and the flashlight beam immediately revealed the room. At first, it looked empty. Dust hung in the air, and the piles of old boxes and junk were scattered all around. But then, I saw something strange, an overturned box near the corner of the room. The lid was slightly ajar, and something had clearly been moved. Dan stepped further into the room, shining the light over the space. That's when we both noticed it, footprints in the dust. The kind of prints you only leave when you've been walking around in a space for a while. My stomach dropped. We hadn't been up here in weeks, and yet, these prints were fresh, too fresh to be from the previous owners. Someone had been here. Someone had been living here. I turned to Dan, my heart racing. What the hell is going on? Dan didn't answer. He just stepped further into the attic, moving toward the corner where the prints led. And that's when he saw it, an old, faded sleeping bag tucked behind some boxes. It was a bright red color, and I could see it had been used recently. The whole room smelled musty, but underneath that, there was a faint odor of food. And sweat. And something else I couldn't quite place. Dan knelt down beside the sleeping bag and lifted it, his hand shaking. Underneath was a small, worn-out backpack. And in the backpack, there were personal items that didn't belong to us. A few shirts, a water bottle, some old magazines, and a pair of worn-out shoes. It was clear someone had been living in this attic for weeks, maybe longer. My mind was racing. Who could it have been? Had someone been hiding up here all this time, waiting for the right moment to leave? Why hadn't we noticed? Before I could ask anything, I heard something else. A sound from behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing. The noise had stopped. We both stood there in silence, our eyes darting around the attic, trying to make sense of it all. Then, slowly, Dan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed the police and told them everything. They said they'd send someone over right away, but I knew we couldn't stay in the house alone, not anymore. We gathered our things quickly and left, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. When the police arrived, they searched the entire attic. They found more evidence that someone had been living there: blankets, a few more belongings, and a small pile of empty cans. It didn't make any sense. The police couldn't figure out who had been there or how they'd gotten in. There were no signs of forced entry, and the attic was sealed off with no windows. We ended up leaving that night, staying in a hotel until they could investigate further. They didn't find anyone still hiding in the attic, but the whole experience left us shaken. It was like someone had been quietly watching us, living in our house without us knowing. We had no idea how long it had been going on. And even now, when I hear the creaks of the floorboards late at night or the odd noises coming from upstairs, I still can't shake the feeling that someone's up there, watching. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would fall for something like this. You always hear about these kinds of stories, right? People getting scammed or tricked, but you never imagine it'll happen to you. I always thought I was a pretty cautious person, but somehow, I let my guard down one evening, and everything changed. It was a regular Thursday night. I was leaving work late. My office is on the edge of town, in a part of the city where the buildings are old and the streets are quiet by the time the sun goes down. I had parked my car just outside a small convenience store, planning to grab a drink before heading home. As I walked out of the store with my soda, I saw a man standing by a bench near the entrance. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself like he was trying to figure something out. I didn't think much of it at first. People act strange all the time, especially late at night in this part of town. But then he saw me. He stopped pacing and approached me quickly, almost as if he had been waiting for me to leave the store. "Excuse me," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm really sorry to bother you, but I need to make an emergency call. My phone died, and I can't find a charger anywhere. I've been trying to reach my brother. Can I borrow your phone just for a minute? It's really important." I don't know why, but something about his voice seemed genuine. Maybe it was the panic in his eyes or the fact that he was standing outside in the cold, looking helpless. He wasn't dressed in any way that screamed trouble, just a simple jacket, jeans, and sneakers. He didn't look like the kind of person who would want to cause harm, at least not to me. "Sure," I said, taking my phone out of my pocket and handing it to him. "Just make it quick." He thanked me repeatedly, holding my phone like it was a lifeline. I stepped back a little, letting him make the call, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. It seemed like he was talking to someone, but his voice was low, almost like he was trying to keep the conversation private. After a minute, he hung up, gave me a brief smile, and handed my phone back. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. My brother was out of town and I couldn't get through to anyone else. You really saved me." I nodded, smiling back politely, though part of me was already getting that uncomfortable feeling that maybe I had done something I shouldn't have. Still, I shrugged it off, assuming that he was just a guy in a bad situation. It happens, right? People lose their phones, or their batteries die, and they need help. He turned and walked off into the street, heading in the opposite direction from where I was parked. I stayed for a few more minutes, sipping my drink and trying to shake the weird feeling in my chest. Something felt off about the whole situation, but I couldn't place my finger on it. I shook my head and decided it was nothing, probably just my imagination running wild. When I got home, I tossed my phone onto the kitchen counter, too tired to even think about it anymore. I had been working all day, and I just wanted to relax. But later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. My phone had been acting funny. It was barely noticeable at first. The screen took a few seconds longer than usual to unlock. My apps were sluggish, and there was this odd little vibration when I tapped on certain things. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes phones glitch for no reason, right? But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A notification popped up from a tracking app one didn't recognize. It wasn't a normal notification. It looked like a map with a dot on it, moving around. I instantly felt my blood run cold. My first thought was that it was some kind of spam or adware that had somehow gotten through my phone's security. I didn't think too much about it at first. I quickly checked my apps, trying to figure out what it was. There was no sign of any app that I had downloaded that could be responsible. Then it hit me, something from earlier in the evening. I'd given my phone to that guy. My stomach turned as I realized what had probably happened. I quickly pulled up my phone's app manager and started searching through the apps, digging deep into system files. And there it was. One small, inconspicuous app labeled location, with no icon, just a name that seemed totally normal. I tapped it, and that's when I saw it, the tracking software. It wasn't just tracking my location, it was keeping tabs on everywhere I'd been over the last few days. I hadn't noticed anything odd before, no unusual apps, no strange permissions, but it was all there now, hidden in the background. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. How long had this been running? Had it been on my phone the entire time? I couldn't believe it. It wasn't a simple bug or a glitch, it was a deliberate invasion. I quickly disabled the app, but my mind kept racing. Who was this guy? How did he know about tracking software? And, most importantly, how many other people had he done this to? I immediately called my phone provider, explained the situation, and they advised me to reset my phone to factory settings. It was the only way to ensure that the tracking software was completely removed. I did it immediately, wiping everything from my phone. The relief I felt when the tracking notification disappeared was palpable, but there was still a gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. What if that wasn't the only thing he'd done? What if there were other things hidden on my phone, things that I couldn't see? It was a huge violation of trust, and I had no idea who to turn to. I told a few friends the next day. Some were understanding, others thought I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something had been done to me that wasn't just an accident. That guy had targeted me, and now my privacy, my personal safety, had been compromised. I haven't seen him since that night, but I keep my phone close now, always double-checking permissions and staying aware of any odd behavior. I still feel a sense of unease, even after deleting everything. It's not just the feeling of being watched, it's the knowledge that someone out there has the ability to track you, to know where you are, without you even realizing it. I keep telling myself I'm being paranoid, that I'm just overthinking it. But when I walk around, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's out there somewhere. I was at the park last Tuesday afternoon, just trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace. It had been one of those weeks where everything felt off, work was stressing me out, family drama was brewing, and I just needed some fresh air. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over everything, and there weren't many people around, just a few joggers and a couple of families having picnics. I found a bench under a tree, opened my book, and tried to tune everything out. I should have known the moment I sat down that I wasn't going to get much peace. But at the time, I thought it was just me being overly anxious. I'd been there for about 20 minutes when I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't look up right away, assuming it was just someone walking by. But the footsteps stopped. "Hey," the man said, his voice almost too calm. It wasn't a loud greeting, just the kind of voice that made you feel like you didn't have a choice but to acknowledge it. I glanced up. He was standing about a foot away from the bench, looking at me with an almost unsettling intensity. Mid-30s, maybe a little older, with dark hair and a face that looked familiar but not in any specific way. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but there was something about him that felt off. Like he didn't belong in this peaceful scene. "Do you come here often?" he asked. It's a typical question, right? One of those small talk openers. I nodded, deciding to be polite. "Yeah, it's nice here. Just needed some quiet today." "Quiet's good, yeah," he said, sitting down on the other end of the bench without asking. He wasn't close, but still, he was uncomfortably near. I figured I'd just finish my chapter and leave, but something in my gut told me to be cautious. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I could feel a shift in the air. He stayed quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "You like to read?" "Yeah, I do," I answered, trying to remain neutral, hoping he would take the hint that I was just here to enjoy the day alone. He leaned forward slightly, and that's when I started getting that prickling feeling along my skin. He wasn't just making small talk anymore, it felt like he was trying to dig deeper. "What's your favorite kind of book?" he asked, his voice low, almost too curious. "I like a lot of different kinds," I said, stiffening. "Just whatever catches my attention." He nodded, then smiled a little, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my stomach twist. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it was getting harder. "Are you married?" he asked, his voice softer now, like it was an innocent follow-up. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "No," I said, unsure why he was asking such personal questions. But the tone of his voice was changing, almost like he was trying to dig into my life, piece by piece. "Do you live around here?" he continued. It wasn't a question anymore. It was more like he was gathering information, like he needed it for some unknown reason. At this point, I knew something was wrong. My hands were starting to sweat, and my heart rate had picked up. This wasn't normal. Most people don't ask these kinds of questions out of nowhere. And I didn't know if it was just the vibe he gave off or the way he was staring at me, but it made me feel small. Like I was trapped in this conversation without a way to escape. I tried to push myself off the bench, clutching my book like it could offer some kind of protection. "I'm sorry, I need to go." But before I could get to my feet, he stood up too, stepping in front of me. "You're leaving already?" His voice had dropped, becoming sharper. I was just trying to talk. I didn't answer, just took a step back. My body was telling me to move quickly, to get away from him, but my legs felt frozen. Wait," he said, his tone suddenly more forceful, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "You can't just sit here and waste my time and then walk away." I froze. What did he mean, waste his time? I didn't owe him anything. I barely even knew him. "I'm sorry," I said, now trying to move around him, trying to be polite but firm. "I don't know you. I'm just trying to enjoy my day." "You owe me a conversation," he said, stepping closer. "You don't get to walk away after wasting my time." I was now completely unnerved. I could feel my body reacting before I even had a chance to process it. My eyes darted around the park, looking for anyone, any kind of help, but the place was empty. The joggers had passed, and the families had packed up and left. It was just the two of us. I stood taller, trying to make myself seem less vulnerable. "I don't owe you anything," I said firmly, stepping back again. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I wasn't going to let him see it. "Leave me alone." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might get angry. But instead, he just stood there, staring at me. The silence between us stretched, and I could feel the tension building, like he was trying to decide what to do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he just shook his head and mumbled something under his breath. "Fine. But don't think you can just do that. People don't just get to ignore me." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, my heart racing in my chest. I could hear his footsteps behind me for a few moments, but when I glanced over my shoulder, he was no longer following. It felt like a lifetime until I reached my car and locked the doors. I drove home with my hands still trembling on the steering wheel, my mind replaying the entire encounter over and over. What had just happened? Why did it feel so wrong? Why did it feel like he was trying to corner me into something I didn't understand? It was just a conversation, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like I was the target of something much darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided a very dangerous situation. I haven't gone back to that park since. And every time I see someone approach me in public now, I can't help but feel that same unease, that same fear. I don't think he was just some random person looking for company. I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm not willing to find out. If anything, I learned to trust my instincts more, because I know now that sometimes people don't need to say much to make you feel trapped. I never thought much about door-to-door salesmen. Like most people, I just ignore them or give them a polite no thanks and go about my day. That's what I thought would happen when I answered the door that day. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I'd just gotten home from work. I had a few things on my mind, a long to-do list, a pile of laundry, and the general exhaustion that came with the middle of the week. But when I opened the door, there stood a man with a clipboard and a smile that looked a little too eager. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, sounding polite enough. "I'm selling home security systems in your neighborhood today. I've got some great deals, and I was wondering if I could speak to you about keeping your home safe." I looked at him for a second, scanning him quickly. He looked clean-cut, probably in his late 30s, dressed in a neat polo shirt and khaki pants. He seemed harmless enough, and I didn't have a good excuse to turn him away. Plus, who doesn't want to be safe, right? "I don't know if I'm interested," I said, trying to keep it short. "I already have a security system." He nodded like he understood. "Of course, ma'am, most people do. But I'm just in the area today, and we've got some new packages that could actually be an upgrade for what you've already got. Just a few minutes of your time, and I can show you a better deal." I felt the push, but I didn't want to be rude, so I took a step back and motioned for him to come inside. "All right, just a few minutes," I said, assuming he'd give me his pitch and leave. Big mistake. He stepped inside without hesitation, and I noticed immediately how much closer he stood than was necessary. Most people give you space when they come into your home, but not him. He hovered a little too close, not giving me the chance to fully close the door behind him. "Great. This will only take a minute," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He pulled out his clipboard and flipped through a few pages. "Do you mind if I ask you a few quick questions? I'll make it brief." I hesitated, but nodded, figuring this would be the normal spiel I'd get from any salesman. He took that as an invitation to keep going. "What time do you typically get home from work?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something strange about the way he asked it, too specific for someone just trying to sell a product. I didn't want to give him too much information, so I tried to keep my answer vague. "Around 6 p.m. "Got it," he said, writing something down. Then he glanced around, taking in my living room, the furniture, the layout. "Do you live alone?" he asked, the question catching me off guard. I forced a smile, trying to deflect it. "Yeah, I live by myself." His smile tightened. Good. Just makes things easier. "Do you have any pets or children at home?" I could feel myself starting to get uncomfortable. His questions were becoming a little too personal, and I didn't like how he was inspecting my home. "I have a cat," I said quickly. "Just a cat." He didn't seem to notice the discomfort in my voice. Okay, he said, making more notes. "And what about valuables? Do you have a safe or anything like that?" I froze. It wasn't the kind of question a salesman should be asking. I thought about asking him to leave right then and there, but I didn't know how to get him out without escalating things. He was already in my home, and I didn't want to make a scene. "I'm not interested in buying anything," I said, trying to sound firm. "Can you please just leave now?" He didn't react immediately, as if my words didn't fully register. Instead, he started walking through my living room, eyes scanning every corner. "Just a few more questions," he said. "This will help us tailor the best offer for you. Are there any windows in the back of the house?" I didn't answer him. I was starting to feel the weight of the situation, realizing he wasn't here to offer me a deal. He was here to learn about my home. Every question felt like it had an ulterior motive, like he wasn't just interested in selling me a security system but in getting a lay of the land. And that's when the panic really started to set in. "I think you need to leave," I said, my voice shaking a little more than I intended. "I'm not interested." He finally turned to face me, and his smile was gone. His expression had shifted into something colder, something I couldn't quite place, and for the first time, I realized how much taller he was than me. He was standing too close again, and I could feel my heart racing. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice no longer warm. "You've got a lovely home. Nice neighborhood. But a place like this, you never know who's watching. You've got to be careful about how much you share. A lot of people out there aren't as trustworthy as you might think." His words hit me like a brick. My heart was pounding, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of the room, to lock the door, to call the police. I could see it now, the way he was casing my house, taking note of everything. The windows, the front door, the layout of the living room. He wasn't here to sell anything. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think it's time for you to go." For a moment, he didn't move, and I thought maybe I had pushed him too far. But then he nodded slowly, his smile returning, but this time it didn't look friendly. "Of course, ma'am," he said, his voice oozing with false politeness. "I'll leave now. Just remember, we're here to help." I stepped back as he walked toward the door, my eyes locked on him, my body tense and ready to slam it shut the moment he stepped out. But as he passed by me, he paused, just long enough to make me feel the weight of his words. "And just remember," he said quietly, almost too quietly for me to hear, "you never know when someone's watching." The door slammed shut behind him the second he stepped out, and I locked it immediately. My heart was still racing as I tried to steady my breathing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police, but I had no proof of anything. All I had was the feeling that he had been here for more than just a sales pitch. I checked every lock in my house, every window. I kept the lights on in every room, hoping it would make me feel safer. And the whole time, I couldn't shake the thought that he knew far too much about my routine. That he wasn't a salesman. He was something far worse. Since then, I've had the locks changed, installed a new security system, and I'm a lot more cautious when answering the door. I don't know if he was just scouting me out or if something worse was coming, but I know now that not everyone who shows up at your door has good intentions. And some people's smiles hide far more than they let on. It started as a normal Thursday. The kind of day you don't expect anything unusual to happen, so you go about your business without thinking twice. I had just finished lunch, and I was scrolling through some emails when I heard a knock at the door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anything, and no one ever visits me during the middle of the day. But I figured it was just another package. I'd been ordering a lot of things lately. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but a large, nondescript cardboard box was sitting on the step. It wasn't even taped shut properly, just sort of hastily sealed with a few strips of packing tape. There was no return address, just a shipping label with my name and address typed in black ink. I figured it was an error, maybe a delivery mix-up. After all, I had made some online purchases recently, so it didn't seem out of place to get an unexpected package. I brought it inside, curiosity getting the better of me. At first, I thought I'd just call the delivery service and have them pick it up, but then I realized I'd better check it myself to avoid making a bigger fuss. As I peeled away the tape, I noticed the box felt unusually heavy for its size. I opened the flaps, and at first, all I saw were layers of bubble wrap and packing peanuts. But as I dug deeper, I froze. Inside the box were several neatly packaged plastic bags, each filled with something I couldn't immediately identify. The first bag contained small vials, some of which looked like they could hold a liquid, others like powder. The second contained what appeared to be stacks of cash, bound tightly with rubber bands. And the third, that was when I realized something was seriously wrong. It was a small, sealed box, labeled in a foreign language, with an ominous, almost clinical-looking symbol on it. I had no idea what any of it was, but my mind immediately began racing, trying to make sense of it. I knew right away that these were not things I should have had in my possession. I was in a complete panic at this point. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What if it was just a mistake? What if it was meant for someone else and I got tangled in something I didn't even understand? I knew I couldn't just throw the package away or ignore it. This wasn't something you could easily explain away, and the weight of it all began to settle in. I paced around my apartment, trying to calm myself down. The more I thought about it, the worse it seemed. I looked out the window and realized something else. There was a car parked across the street. It had been there for a while, and I don't remember seeing it when I left for lunch. At first, I told myself it was probably just a neighbor's car, but then I noticed something strange. The person sitting inside wasn't moving. I stared at the car for a long time, trying to make out any details through the blinds. There was a man inside, but he wasn't looking at anything. He was just sitting there, still, like he was waiting. It made my skin crawl. I'd never seen him before, and I didn't recognize the car either. Could this be a coincidence? I went back to the package, still unsure what to do. I carefully closed it up, trying not to disturb anything too much. My mind raced with the possibilities. If this was a mistake, why wasn't anyone trying to retrieve it? The more I thought about it, the more I started to suspect this wasn't an error at all. Someone had deliberately sent this package to my home. I pulled my phone out and checked the delivery tracking. Nothing. The status said it was delivered, but there was no sign of a shipment order from my account. It didn't add up. I tried calling the courier service, but they were closed for the day. That left me with no answers. The car across the street was still there, parked in the same spot, with the man still sitting inside, doing nothing. At this point, I felt completely exposed. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I decided to take a chance and called a friend. I told him about the package, about the man in the car, and how everything felt off. He didn't have much advice, but he did tell me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. As I was talking to him, I saw something else, a shadow darting quickly past the window. I froze. Someone was walking across the yard toward my front door. It wasn't the man in the car. This was someone else. I hung up the phone and moved quietly to the window, peeking through the blinds just enough to see outside. The person walking toward my house didn't seem to notice I was watching. I couldn't make out any details, but their gait was hurried. My breath caught in my throat when they reached the porch. They stopped right at the door, almost like they knew exactly where they were going. I didn't know what to do. The last thing I wanted to do was open the door and face whatever was happening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I slowly backed away from the window. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. The strange package, the man in the car, and now this person at my door. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things, but it felt like I was being watched. Like the whole situation was a setup. I locked all the windows and doors, double-checked everything, and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police if necessary. I looked out the window again, and the man in the car was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The person who had been walking across the yard, they were gone too, just vanished into thin air. Had they come for the package? Were they watching to make sure I didn't call the authorities? I had no idea, but I knew that whatever was going on, it wasn't normal. The next few hours felt like an eternity. I kept my phone close and stayed away from the windows, too scared to check if anyone was outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, wondering if someone would come back for the package. The next morning, I contacted the police, and they came by to take the package for evidence. They didn't give me many details but assured me they would look into it. They seemed to believe it was a mix-up, though the fact that it had no tracking or return address made them suspicious. It's been weeks since then, and I still don't feel safe. I moved my furniture around, changed my daily routine, and made sure I'm always paying attention to what's going on outside. I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me, waiting for me to slip up. And every time I hear a knock at the door, or see a car stop across the street, I get that same sinking feeling in my stomach. I've never felt more paranoid in my life. The whole thing doesn't add up, and I'm starting to think the package wasn't a mistake after all. Whoever sent it, whoever's been watching, they haven't left. And I don't know when they'll be back. I don't know why I didn't trust my instincts from the start. Maybe I was too desperate. Maybe I was just too eager for something that felt like a break, but either way, it was a mistake. It all started a few weeks ago. I had been job hunting for months, sending out application after application, going to interviews that led nowhere. I was tired of the rejection emails, tired of not knowing where I was headed. Then, one day, I received an email with the subject line, "Exciting job opportunity, interview request." At first, I thought it was spam, but something about it caught my attention. The email was professional enough, no red flags, just a brief description of a position that sounded pretty amazing: marketing manager at a growing startup with a generous salary and benefits. The recruiter mentioned they had found my resume through LinkedIn, which felt weirdly personal, but I dismissed the thought. I clicked on the email, and after reading it through a few times, I decided to respond. The recruiter got back to me almost immediately. We exchanged a few more emails, and everything seemed legitimate. She suggested meeting at their office, gave me the time and address, and even sent me a confirmation. I still wasn't 100% sure, but I figured, why not? It was a job that sounded too good to pass up, and I was getting tired of waiting for anything else. The address was odd. It wasn't in the usual business district, but I thought maybe they were just starting out in a less expensive area. When I typed the address into my GPS, it led me to an industrial part of town, a block full of warehouses and old factories. I drove down the street, past what seemed like abandoned buildings, each one older and more rundown than the last. I almost turned around right then, but the thought of landing a job that could change everything kept me going. I parked my car in front of a large, dilapidated warehouse. The building looked like it hadn't been used in years. Windows were broken, there was graffiti on the walls, and the door looked like it had been forced open. I texted the recruiter to let her know I had arrived. She responded quickly, telling me to go in, that she'd be waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment. Everything about this place screamed wrong, but I didn't want to come off as paranoid. I had already come this far, and turning back now felt like a failure. So I took a deep breath, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a few dim overhead lamps. It smelled musty and damp, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something that wasn't meant for me. The floor was covered in dust, and there were random pieces of old furniture scattered around, most of it covered in plastic tarps. It looked like no one had bothered to clean in years. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else was there. The place was eerily quiet, except for the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty space. I called out, "Hello?" My voice felt too loud in the silence. "Right here," came a voice from behind me, and I jumped. A woman appeared from the shadows. She was tall, dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in the setting, but her smile was warm, too warm. "You must be Emily," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah. Welcome." I shook her hand, trying to ignore the unease that crept up my spine. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite place, but I chalked it up to nerves. I had to keep my cool. This was a job opportunity, right? She led me toward a small desk near the far wall, where a laptop sat open. The office didn't look like a real office, more like a forgotten corner of an old warehouse. There was no receptionist, no secretary, no sign of any other employees. Sarah sat down and motioned for me to do the same. "Let's get started," she said. "I've read through your resume, and I think you're exactly what we need." I nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. Maybe it wasn't as traditional as I had expected, but people were doing things differently now, right? She clicked a few keys on her laptop and turned it toward me. "This is the position," she said, pointing to the screen. It was all about managing campaigns, social media presence, and branding, just like the email had said. The pay is great. You'll be working with a small team, but there's a lot of room for growth. I smiled, relieved. This sounded like what I had been looking for, what I needed. "Great," I said. "So, what's the next step?" She leaned back in her chair, watching me closely, almost too closely. "Well, we like to get to know our candidates a bit more personally. We're looking for someone who can really integrate into our company culture." I raised an eyebrow, slightly confused. "Sure, but what do you mean by that?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Tell me, Emily, what does your day-to-day look like? What are your goals? What do you do in your free time? What's your relationship with your family like?" I froze. These questions weren't the kind of things you asked in a job interview. They were personal, invasive, and completely out of place. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. I work and then I hang out with friends. I don't really see how that's relevant to the position." Sarah didn't look bothered. In fact, she smiled. "Oh, it's very relevant. You see, in our company, we value commitment to the job, and we like to get a sense of what drives our candidates. What's behind the surface, you know?" I wasn't buying it anymore. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I didn't want to look rude. I glanced toward the door, and that's when I noticed something else. There were no windows in the back of the warehouse. No exit signs. No escape. It felt like I had just walked into a trap. "Sarah, I think I should go," I said, standing up. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes did. "Oh, Emily, I'm afraid you don't understand. This is just the beginning. You can't leave yet." I felt my heart race as I backed toward the door. "What are you talking about?" Before I could reach the exit, Sarah stood up and blocked the door. "I'm sorry, but you're not leaving. We're not finished here. The interview has just started."